Enduring Secret. I'm your host, Jeff Crudell. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is episode 112. It's hard for me to once again issue an apology of sorts for taking so long to get this next episode out. It's been another 2 weeks again to create episode 112, and even as a listener following as the podcast grows, I know for those of you who have been right there with me all the way, whether you started early and have been steady at it, or whether you started later and have binged listened to catch up, there are many of you who would like me to produce the episodes faster than I am doing these days, like I was doing in the beginning of the podcast series more than a year and a half ago. Well, I would too. And as I've mentioned so many times before on this podcast, right now, at this moment of life, for me, I am balancing a number of different and equally important obligations. Some of those obligations came about after I retired and were not there as a restriction in the very beginning of the podcast. And so lately it's become more than just a challenge to adhere to a schedule. Be that as it may, I'll use one of the many colloquialisms that I've used so many times here in the past, and that I say and have said so very often in life. Mostly I've said it to my children, but right now I am saying it to myself. And the phrase is, well, just stay at it. And I am telling myself that even as time becomes, again, in my life, a more precious commodity. But while it's become more difficult once again to find the time, my enthusiasm has not waned. In fact, my enthusiasm to produce more episodes is in full force these days. Still, I appreciate very much that you have been patient and stayed with me, and for that, I truly want to reward the listening community with more and more episodes. I have plenty of ideas, and as I have just said, I have plenty of energy to produce them. It's just time, and that is forcing the issue in some ways on what episodes to produce next. Today's episode is a bit of an unusual one for me. You see, up to this point, it's been somewhat easy to choose the material for the next episode, whatever the next episode was covering. The process followed a rather direct path, a logical path, an intuitive path, either based on the time sequence of events or items that just lead to one another in the storytelling world that I am in. We will still use that approach, but it gets a little more difficult as we move away from the main body of episodes that covered a logical sequence of known events related to the assassination. This week, for a few days, I'm back in South Florida, and on the plane flight down yesterday, there was a young man sitting across the aisle, and as we got up to leave the plane in a friendly way, he asked me if I was an author. I assumed that he did so because I had my laptop out and a few books, and I was intermittently reading and taking some notes for what would be this next podcast. I explained to him that I wasn't an author, but rather I was a podcaster. His questioning continued, and in response, I explained what the podcast was about and the extent of the episodes to date. His immediate question for me was whether I would ever write a book on the podcast. My response was, well, possibly, but probably not. And the good news is that that's a long way off because there is a lot more podcasting to do related to JFK, the Enduring Secret. A lot more. In order for us to say, mission accomplished. And what was the mission anyway? Does anyone remember that far back? Well, I do, of course. Because every time I publish an episode, I repeat that same episode description. We set out in the beginning to be a comprehensive tutorial on the Kennedy assassination. That was a pretty broad mission and a lot to take on, and I think we are getting a pretty good grade so far at just that. We're not deep researchers taking this to the next level. What we are doing is trying to tie the story together in a way that's comprehensive and comprehensible. You may recall that in the earliest of episodes, I used the analogy that we were taking a trip across the country, going from the East Coast to the West Coast, with the idea that eventually, even though we might wander a bit and not take the straightest of routes, that we would eventually end up at the Golden Gate. Well, I'm proud to say that we are well past Kansas now. We are more than halfway there, and the big question left is, where do we go from here? In what order do we tackle the remaining topics from here on out? And so today's episode is a wander on the one hand that might sound a little bit like advertisements for future episodes, snippets of so many things that we have yet to cover and that I hope will invigorate or reinvigorate your own enthusiasm for future episodes. But it's also a request by me from you for input. I've gotten a little bit of this from a few of you throughout the podcast, but frankly, not much. That is not a criticism, as I did not ask for it or expect it or require it in any way. But where to go next and where to wander to and from is truly the question, and input from all of you will surely be helpful. So to that end, I have one more analogy I would like to use, which I believe so aptly describes what predicament we are in and where we go to next. It's an analogy that involves a lake. Many of you know that I spend time at a lake. You see, in the southeastern portion of the United States, most of the lakes are man-made, many of them products of the work done in the 1930s during the Roosevelt administration. And particularly, some of the ones I am familiar with were developed by the Tennessee Valley Authority, or TVA, primarily as a means of generating electricity and fostering economic development for the region. Many of those lakes were formed in the hilly or mountainous areas of the Appalachians, and as such, the lake might have a large body of water in the center of what was, at one moment, a valley. And now, that valley is a lake and not a valley. And these lakes, they contain numerous fingers, almost like tentacles on an octopus, born from what used to be the areas between the hills and mountains, each with an interesting geography that wanders along as it takes the explorer in a separate direction away from the main body of water, but with each of these individual trips down a different finger providing a unique and satisfying moment on the lake. While each trip down each of these fingers has beautiful water and beautiful scenery, you can only explore one at a time. And once you're done, you have to make your way back to the main body of water before you can pivot and go down the next one of these fingers. It's a process for sure. Where we are at in this long journey to the Golden Gate as it relates to the JFK assassination is that we have covered most shoreline on the main body of water. Oh, there is plenty more material to cover. The little lake that I spend time at in the summer has 75 miles of shoreline, and mostly it's shoreline contained in those little fingers that I just described. The main body of water is a small portion of the total. In fact, it pales in comparison to the total shoreline miles contained in those fingers. It's a deceiving aspect that becomes apparent when exploring the lake on a boat. Well, enough of the analogies. Let's get down to the questions at hand. The assassination occurred, the body was carried back to Washington, and then the autopsy took place. The chief suspect was apprehended, interrogated, and then murdered. The defendant was never brought to trial. So the entire quest now is about putting together 1,000,000 shattered pieces of the puzzle that could not be reunited formally in the absence of a trial or a more comprehensive investigation that was truly conducted to get at the truth. For anyone who has put together a puzzle, a big one, you know there are different ways to go about doing just that. My wife does puzzles, and she separates the pieces by the number of prongs on the puzzle piece. One way of connecting the parts. We all must have a method, and that is but one. But it is an effective one that seems to work for her. She's pretty good with puzzles. And we have to have one too. Surely it will be different than the way other purveyors of the Kennedy story approach this. But as long as it's effective, accurate, understandable, and entertaining, I think most of us will be good with it. There are so many theories on who might have killed JFK, but in reality there are a handful of basic groups which are considered to be of greatest potential as suspects. I believe them to be as follows, and they are in no particular order. First, the mob, or organized crime, including perhaps a connection with the Teamsters. Second, the CIA or some break-off group of the CIA. Third, the military-industrial complex, along with a mix of ultra-right-wingers such as members from the John Birch Society. And last, it has also been suggested that some international fascist groups could also be involved, which might include selected Cubans or Russians that may even have had ties to those governments. And as you might expect, there are endless theories that involve variations on these four basic themes as they mix and match the characters. And with good reason, because in those days, so many of these characters were like peas in a pod. We'll get to that. One such variation even puts LBJ as a central character who spearheaded the assassination, or at least was a player in it. These assassination theories go from quite plausible to quite hard to believe. But that doesn't completely discount that some of them may hold significant water when it comes to the truth of the matter. That's the puzzle. So let's turn today's episode into a complete wander on many of the topics that we might touch on in future episodes, and then hopefully your interest will be highlighted, and I welcome you to provide feedback to me at podcastjfk@gmail.com. And you can also post on the episode blog for episode 112 at www.podcastjfk.com. I will make some decisions on what direction to go and what finger of the lake to go down first, so to speak, and then get going on providing more episodes to you. And yes, for those who are wondering, we will try to explore all of them, or most of them anyway, in our quest to get to the Golden Gate and to fulfill our mission of delivering to you, when it's all said and finished, a comprehensive tutorial of the JFK assassination. Oh, and one more thing. Many of you have asked whether I am going to provide my own conclusions at some point. And the answer is yes. But you will have to wait and listen to the very last episode. The very last one before we turn out the lights and go to sleep. So, without further ado, let's listen to episode 112 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. How about Sylvia Odio? She was a Cuban exile living in Dallas. She had very prominent parents who ended up in prison, thrown in jail by the Castro government, as they involved themselves actively in procuring arms to give to the anti-Castro Cubans. Sometime during the last week of September 1963, she got a knock on her door, and it was three men, two of them Latin and one white man. And the white man introduced himself as Leon Oswald. At some point later after the encounter, one of those Latin men called Odio on the phone and engaged in a telephone conversation with her, almost egging her on and indicating that Oswald was loco, which is nuts in Spanish, and made the statement indicating that Oswald had said that the Cubans had no guts and that they should shoot the president. This is one of the more significant and credible examples of where there may have been a second Oswald. And it's also an incredible example of where the Warren Commission took overt steps to mischaracterize the visit and to hide the clear problems that this incident created for the conclusions that the Warren Commission had made. Having Lee Harvey Oswald positively identified and in two places at once, recall this incident in Dallas took place on a date that the official timeline has Oswald in Mexico. Well, that is a problem, and the FBI particularly went to great lengths to make the problem go away. So, all I can say is, when we get to this one, it will be a great episode. How about the story of Jose Aleman? He was a wealthy Cuban exile who was also an FBI informant, and he met with Florida mobster Santos Traficante in September 1962 at the Scott Byron Hotel in Miami Beach. Traficante In the middle of a conversation about the way the Kennedys were treating Jimmy Hoffa, well, Aleman would quote Trafficante saying, "He's not going to be reelected, he's going to be hit." Aleman made those statements under oath on March 12, 1977, in testimony made to the House Select Committee on Assassinations. That'll make another good episode in the making, too, and what happened to Aleman in the aftermath. Of course, the mob is such a big part of this story, and we obviously have to start with Johnny Roselli and Robert Mayhew and the Vegas Bug, and just the whole connection between the mob and the CIA at that moment in time in the world that we were living in. Well, there will be much more on the mob and the CIA. And of course, the discussions on the mob will include stories about Santos Trafficante, Carlos Marcello, and Sam Giancana, all major players in this story. How about the incredible story of Judith Exner, a beautiful woman who turned out to be both Sam Giancana's girlfriend and JFK's girlfriend, all at the same time, thanks to a little bit of help from Frank Sinatra. Folks, you can't write this stuff. Okay, I'm on a ramble now, and these are really in no particular order. How about the story where Oswald has been identified in Clinton, Louisiana, and possibly in the same car with Clay Shaw and David Ferrie? There's a lot of details to this story, and that'll make another good episode. And obviously the reason for doing that is to tie David Ferrie, Clay Shaw, and Oswald together. You know, we haven't touched upon Jack Ruby at all, really, and the nexus of connections that he had with the Dallas Police Department and with the mobster underworld, and possibly with Lee Harvey Oswald himself, and the rest of those characters from New Orleans. After all, Jack was a gun runner, and he had been actively engaged in running guns to Cuba. Again, another good story for an episode. Actually, many good stories, and many episodes, potentially. How about all of the suspicious deaths? I've had a number of you ask if we are going to do an episode on that, and as you know, there are really good, singularly dedicated books to the topic. And yes, there are an incredible number of suspicious deaths. Perhaps the most famous one is the death of Dorothy Kilgallen. And we will definitely have to do an episode or episodes on Dorothy. She was rumored to have been about ready to break the case, if you listen to Mark Lane, and she was the only reporter granted a private interview with Jack Ruby, and she did so before her death. Boy, back to the Cubans. The Cuban connection and that thread runs deep, because the setting was New Orleans, and New Orleans was a haven for anti-Castro activity at that time in the United States. There are so many stories to tell. The training out on Lake Pontchartrain of the Cuban exile groups, the connections to similar groups in Miami, the connections to the JM Wave station, the CIA station. Characters like Antonio Veciana, who was actually a CPA, that's right, an accountant, turned killer, anti-communist, a man who started Alpha 66, one of the most infamous Cuban exile groups that aggressively advanced the idea of using force to retake Cuba. Veciana would eventually strike up a relationship with Gaetan Fonzi, the famous investigator, who worked for the House Select Committee on Assassinations. It was Veciana who later in life would connect the two names Maurice Bishop and David Atlee Phillips, a bit of a confirmation of the work already done by Jack Anderson in the late 60s. Oh, and how about Frank Sturgis then, and players like Howard Hunt that might lead us into the discussion about the curious case of Liberty Lobby, where a civil case happened to bring out testimony under oath relevant to the JFK assassination. In all of this, Veciana swears that he saw Maurice Bishop in the company of Lee Harvey Oswald in Dallas. How about the debunked stories of James Files, who was a man who sat in prison who made what might have appeared to sound like credible representations that he worked with Charles Nicoletti, another well-known mob hitman, and he worked together with him to make the hit that day in Dallas. Equally absurd and now debunked are some of the claims of Judith Baker. But not everything she said was untrue, and that gets us into topics like Mary Sherman and her suspicious death and her connection to Oswald and what was underneath the very real connection that she had to the Ochsner Clinic. Was there a far-out CIA clinical project that tied together David Ferrie and others who were in that web, or was it just fodder? We haven't covered any of them yet. And we haven't covered the Oswald Mexico trip yet in the story. In that story, Win Scott, a major CIA force in Mexico, is at the center of the mysterious disappearance of his personal Mexico files after his death, including those related to the Oswald incident. And that'll make a great episode. And who might appear in that one? Well, we'll get to know James Angleton a little better in that one. He's a character, all right. He shows up and has footprints in many ways in many of these episodes. He was the infamous CIA man in charge and obsessed with finding what was thought to be a mole within the CIA. He ran the counterintelligence services within the CIA for a long time, and there are some very eerie moments of his existence in this story. He was a naysayer about Yuri Nosenko, and to the very day he died, he felt that Nosenko was not a legitimate defector and was, in fact, a Soviet agent actively engaged as part of his defection plan. How about the startling revelations that H.R. Haldeman wrote in his own book after he left the Nixon administration? As you recall, he was one of the two closest aides that Nixon had before the Watergate chips began to fall. He would say in his book that Nixon was actually saying in the Watergate tapes things about the Kennedy assassination. Nixon would use references to the Bay of Pigs, but what Haldeman said was that what Nixon was really trying to say every time he used that term was really a comment about the Kennedy assassination. Haldeman would go on to say that the CIA essentially expunged everything it possibly could about the Kennedy assassination in those few years following 1963. I know we keep bouncing back and touching upon the Cubans because there are so many of them to cover. I won't even name them here, but there are incredible stories about folks like Sergio Aracha Smith, Eladio Del Valle. But let me back up here for a second, because any discussion about the Cubans has to take us way back into the late 50s so that we can talk about the transition from Batista and the intermingling of the mob on the island and the connection of CIA interests in the Caribbean in general, where these 3 points of light came together. The CIA might have been interested in its war on communism, but in the end, the strange objectives of all of these parties made for interesting bedfellows. Oh my gosh, there is a whole series of episodes there, and we would definitely end up covering what happened in the aftermath of the Bay of Pigs, including things like Operation Mongoose, where the Kennedy administration pivoted to its next approach to removing Castro from power and democratizing Cuba. We haven't touched much upon the CIA yet. Even though we danced around the topics, so many rich topics, including Oswald's 201 file and the whole backdrop of the CIA involvement in the Bay of Pigs in the aftermath of that, you might be interested in the story of JM Wave, which was the largest CIA operation located in the Western Hemisphere, and I believe the second largest in the world at that time, and it was placed right on the campus of the University of Miami. There were incredible characters involved in that operation back then, men like Ted Shackley, and you'll hear more interaction with characters like Maurice Bishop, yes, David Atlee Phillips, this person we mentioned earlier, and the connection that was uncovered by Jack Anderson, the famous New York Times columnist. And there was even a plot at one moment that was foiled at the last minute, a plot that was designed to kill Anderson. These folks would stop at nothing. It gets even weirder when we figure out that there is a major character at the CIA. His name is Cord Meyer, and at one point in history, there was actually a thinking that JFK and Cord Meyer were considered intellectual equals and candidates in the same category for future greatness. Both born out of Eastern blue blood families and gone to Eastern schools with some level of preeminence, and then an incredible and iconic twist of fate where Meyer and his beautiful wife Mary would divorce. Her name was Mary Pinchot Meyer, and after the divorce, Mary Pinchot Meyer became a lover of JFK. Even though the Meyers were divorced, there was perhaps a jealousy on Cord Meyer's part. And if you listen to Howard Hunt, possibly that is the case, because he says Cord Meyer is one of the individuals who architected the assassination. It gets more weird because Mary Pinchot Meyer was Ben Bradley's sister-in-law. Ben Bradley was the editor of the Washington Post at one point, and at that moment in time, it was quite a close confidant relationship between he and JFK. Right after Mary Pinchot Meyer was murdered, and that was after JFK's assassination, but not long after, well, guess who shows up onto the scene? James Angleton. And he shows up to retrieve her diary. The story is fascinating, and whether it was just purely in the name of national security or whether there was more to the involvement of James Angleton at that moment, well, You just have to hang out to listen to the episode when it comes out. How about the ultra-right-winger who was captured on tape by an informant just weeks before the assassination, saying that Kennedy would be hit and it would be using a high-powered rifle with shots taken from a high-rise building? I guess I already mentioned Mexico at least a couple of times, but there is a rich story of Mexico to be told, and it's not just about Scott's papers. We'll cover all that, I think, in a separate series of episodes. How about the CIA officer Richard Case Nagel, who walked into a bank and fired shots in order that he might be arrested and have an airtight alibi so that he couldn't be connected in any way to the assassination, patsy or otherwise? This is, in fact, one of the more bizarre stories of the JFK enduring secret. Let's see, what else? Well, we can't get out of here without talking about Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters, and his connection to the principal mobsters who are the principal suspects, if you believe in the mob theory. He was a man who hated the Kennedys, and he didn't do so privately, he did so very publicly, and he was a man that knew violence well. Was his disappearance in any way connected to the Kennedy assassination? I think we've already covered Woody Harrelson's father, Charles Harrelson, in what is one of the more bizarre stories as well. A man high on drugs, cornered in the middle of the desert by Texas Rangers, screaming, in essence, that confession that he was part of the assassination team. A man himself who was the only man in a 100-year stretch charged and convicted with killing a federal judge. How about the curious story of Yuri Yunosenko? That is one that I've already said we definitely have to tell. A man who actually reviewed Oswald's file when he was in Minsk, part of the security apparatus, fairly high up, and who defects afterward, and that we have access to perhaps understand the real truth about whether or not Oswald was a Soviet agent or not. How about the Garrison grand jury investigation and ultimately the Clay Shaw trial? I don't think there is any chance of us getting out of here without covering that and tying all of the curious characters together, most of them men from New Orleans, like Guy Bannister and Jack Martin. Talk about suspicious deaths. How about the story of Bernard Festerwald, a prominent attorney who was active in the Coalition on Political Assassination? How about more on the Russian community that Oswald interacted with, and perhaps the most important one of that group was George de Mohrenschildt, who clearly had ties to the CIA and who himself had quite an odd and suspicious ending, apparently blowing his own brains out in Manalapan, which is a small town close to Palm Beach in Florida, near where I'm at. And he did so right around the time he was supposed to testify for the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Speaking of creepy CIA characters, how about Bill Harvey? Here was a guy famous for overseeing an underground spy tunnel in Berlin that was not so clandestine to the Soviets, but everyone on our side thought so. Another character that Howard Hunt said was part of the original assassination group. Oh, and speaking of CIA players, we can't wait to air some of the testimony of Richard Helms, who was the director of plans at that time and eventually became the head of the CIA, and he was also eventually charged with perjury as the investigation of the CIA continued throughout the 60s. There are so many lesser-known players in this large play that we are bringing to you. How about people like Robert Gemberling, an FBI agent who is in charge of submitting the list of individuals who were written down in Oswald's notebook? And he conveniently deleted the name of FBI agent James Hosty. So many people with so many major acts of the play. How about G. Ray Gill, the mob attorney for Carlos Marcello, and a man who represented in some way almost every witness brought to bear in the Garrison trial? How about more on Marina Oswald? She was the woman who was closest to this man, and she herself might have had more deeper connections to the mother country. How about the story of Interpen and Gary Patrick Hemming and Lauren Hall? Crazy quasi-connections to the CIA, the Cubans, and men who clearly were accused at one point or another of being part of the assassination team or knowledgeable about its existence. How about poor Jacqueline Hess, who's another minor player in a way? She was the official researcher for the House Select Committee on Assassinations, who had the overt responsibility of determining whether all of the suspicious deaths were in any way connected to the assassination. After much research, she concluded that they were not. I really have to scratch my head on that one. How about the story of Erlane Roberts and car number 207 that drove up and honked its horn at the rooming house where Oswald lived, just moments within the time that he had reached the rooming house. It was a police car, and it did so within minutes of Oswald making his way back and changing before he headed for the Texas Theater. In a more broader sense, we might ask the question of whether or not there was a connection between RFK and JFK assassinations. I have someone who was close to this podcast who has urged me to do a series on RFK's assassination. That leads us into more surly questions of whether or not people like Marilyn Monroe and their deaths had any connection to any of this. Now, while that certainly had a connection to the story of the Kennedys, we don't know whether it had any connection at all to the assassinations. I could go on, but it's getting late, and I wanted to give you a flavor for what is coming. These are great stories, but they are like fingers on a lake. I think it's time for you to sit back and enjoy the wander, and I'll do my best to keep all of this in some form of logical sequence as best I can, so that you, as a listener, can absorb it methodically, logically, well, as much logic as can be applied to some of this, because we are now in the world of the illogical and the world of speculation for some. But we'll do our best on all of these topics. Please don't forget to reach out and give me your feedback and input at podcastjfk@gmail.com or post your ideas on the blog for episode 112 at www.podcastjfk.com. See you again soon as we get back on the road and produce the next episode, 113. Thank you for listening to episode 112 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. Welcome to JFK and the Enduring Secret. I'm your host, Jeff Crudell. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is episode 113. Well, I want to thank all of you for responding to my request in episode 112, and I do appreciate the feedback that I have received from a number of you on the JFK assassination topics that you would like to hear about. I will make a couple of observations about the comments I have received so far. First of all, every one of them has been in such good taste, and that is very gratifying, and I thank you for that. And the things you'd like to hear about are pretty varied and somewhat specific, which is great. And while that doesn't necessarily give me an editorial right to do things completely out of order, I guess really the whole exercise here is to figure out just that. How out of order do we need to be? Now, this is not like a judge saying you're out of order. This is simply a question of sequence. That is tricky, so I am going to try and do it, but be communicative at the same time about how the overall timeline of Oswald fits into these topics as we start to jump around a little bit more. So, where we left off after episode 112 was Oswald's mad dash out of the Soviet Union and back to the United States. There are many details there and some interesting things too, like the idea that Oswald expected to be met by reporters as he stepped back onto American soil, and he was fully prepared with alternative answers to various questions that the press might be preparing to ask him. Only that throng of reporters, well, it never showed up, and he never got his 15 minutes of fame. That did not make him happy, and he communicated that very clearly to his brother. On a practical side, he ended up with more mundane things to attend to, like how to obtain funds for the remainder of the trip from New York back to Dallas. And to that end, he ended up contacting his family in Texas to arrange for one source of additional funds to pay for his airplane tickets. At some point, we'll say more about this period and episode, but for right now, we're going to pivot into more meatier topics, or at least more relevant topics. The Oswalds got back to Dallas in late summer 1962. Most of the history from that point until around April 1963 was a period of trying to establish a home in Dallas with no real funds in hand, and a period where the Oswalds' marital problems enlarged themselves. Lee would also set up certain post office boxes and purchase the rifle and a pistol in this intervening time frame, using at least one alias. And while the idea of a post office box seems nefarious, the fact of the matter is that they were more prevalent in those days, and especially useful if you moved around a lot or had no permanent address, which, by the way, was exactly the MO of the Oswalds at that moment. It was also a time where the Oswalds were introduced to the Russian community in Dallas, which is a concentrated cadre of folks that included many individuals who gravitated toward Marina. Remember, Marina at that time was a beautiful and young Russian girl who spoke no English. So that group became an important cultural and communications support system for her and was somewhat critical for Marina in her own transition, especially for a young mother with one baby there and a second baby soon to be on the way. It was a period of time that those same Russians got to know Lee and were generally not so enamored with him. The bottom line is that for the most part, the Russians in Dallas that surrounded the Oswalds did not like Lee, and he did not like them. He was jealous of them and generally jealous of the fact that they showered Marina with some level of material gifts as she and Lee were starting out in this new world, the world of the United States, and they were doing it with almost nothing in hand. Gifts that Oswald couldn't buy himself, given his meager earnings picture in those early months back in the States. It was during this time frame that perhaps the most significant relationship in that Russian community would occur, and that is with George de Mohrenschildt and his wife. No doubt that is going to be a completely separate topic that we will need to address. That is, who de Mohrenschildt was, their history of interaction with the Oswalds, and what came after the assassination, including de Mohrenschildt's interaction with a Dutch journalist in his untimely death in Manalapan, which is a small and very exclusive community near Palm Beach, Florida. Strangely, it happened right around the time that he was summoned to testify in front of the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Was he CIA? Well, we will get to that soon enough. But today is not about the Russians or de Mohrenschildt or any of the time in Dallas leading up to the General Walker shooting. Rather, it is about the General Walker shooting itself. And the reason we are jumping to this important topic is because in the analysis of Oswald himself, this was a key element cited by the Warren Commission, a key piece of evidence that reinforces the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald was capable of assassination, and that, in fact, he was the killer. After all, if Oswald had taken a rifle and hunted down General Walker and took a shot at him with the intent to kill him, isn't that totally relevant and demonstrative that Oswald very well could have been doing the same thing from the 6th floor of the book depository when making the shot to kill the president? Totally logical, and that's why reviewing the facts of this incident may very well be revealing to the case against Oswald himself. And folks, you can't write this stuff. There is more than one mystery in this act of the play as well. The Walker shooting happened in April 1963, about 9 months after Oswald had come back to Dallas, and his life had wandered aimlessly through that time frame, or at least we think. The shooting was frightening enough to Marina, presuming she was telling the truth about it, and under her version of the story, probably was frightening to Oswald himself, assuming he actually did it. And as Marina tells the story, he was likely motivated at that point after the shooting to lay low and to get out of town, actually out of Texas, in fact, and really flee the scene. It was just 2 weeks or so later, after the shooting in April 1963, that he would leave Dallas and head for his hometown, New Orleans, in what seemingly was to do just that. And of course, the story picks up there in New Orleans, and we have already heard at least some of his spring-summer 1963 activities in New Orleans, including the details about the handing out of Fair Play for Cuba pamphlets and his incident on the street corner with Carlos Briere that then prompted the radio and television interviews for Oswald. And yes, there are many more details and stories to come when it comes to New Orleans. Much more. But again, we are getting a little ahead of ourselves. So, without further ado, Let's listen to episode 113 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. It was the night of April 10th, 1963, and a shot rang out which nicked the window of the study at General Edwin Walker's house in Dallas. Had it not nicked the mullion in the window, it may very well have hit and killed General Walker, as the bullet sailed through the glass, whizzed by his head, and then finally embedded in the wall. Walker was preparing his tax return that night, and the shot produced fragments that resulted in shrapnel wounds on the general's arm. The gunman was never identified.
General, will you describe for us just what happened last night?
Well, the police from the city came in to investigate a rifle shot that was fired into the house, fired through the west window, and hit the sill and hit the wall across the room and went through the wall over the desk at which I was sitting. This happened at 9 o'clock last. Well, there's an enemy within this country, and of course it's the same enemy that represents the position that we should do away with the House Un-American Activities Committee, that we should destroy our local police forces, and that we should do away with our military forces. These are the, you might say, the anti-Americans as far as our traditions, heritage, and Constitution are concerned. And there are plenty of them in this country, in spite of the federal government's position that there is no threat from within. There is a threat from within, and this is just further indications that there is a threat to our individual rights and liberties.
What do you propose to do now? Are you going to go out making out your tax reforms at that same desk, or doing work in your house as usual?
The House will continue as usual. There will be no change, except that we'll double our efforts in every area, and this only indicates the necessity for it. It's been interesting to note that as a result of our tour from coast to coast, there's been much response to what's been said on this tour. People are very much interested and quite upset across the land. It's very indicative that they are not being properly represented in Washington, D.C.
Who was General Walker, and why is he important in this story? Well, the obvious answer related to the why portion is that someone attempted to assassinate him, as we said earlier, and once you establish that Oswald was an assassin, engaging in a similar prior act, that he tried to kill a political figure by firing a rifle at them, and Walker was a political figure of sorts, too, at that time. We'll get to all of that in a minute. Well, then, all of that is a plausible indicator of violence through a prior act. You see, linking the Walker shooting to Oswald was designed to help reasonably demonstrate that Oswald could also be the assassin of the president. That's the Warren Commission story, and they are sticking to it. But wait a minute, lest we put words in their mouth, let's start by hauling out Warren Commission Exhibit Number 1, the FBI summary report on the assassination. The story of Edwin Walker is right there on pages 20 through 22. Keep in mind that the FBI, during the early stages of the assassination investigation, when they were under so much pressure to wrap up the investigation quickly, they were really reaching for a concrete motive or set of motives to pin on Oswald. Look, establishing motive is fundamental to proving any murder case. But in those early moments, there was not much there to grab onto when it came to Oswald and a motive. And it would stay that way for the months to come as the Warren Commission reviewed the work of the FBI and made their own review and conclusions, which are also clearly set out in the body of the report. Ultimately, the Warren Commission report would concede that they had not found a solid and concrete motive. And is that not surprising from a man who had professed some level of admiration for Kennedy? Regardless, what the commission said was that Oswald's actions were most likely a result of 5 key factors which they viewed as being present. Quickly, let's revisit those 5 key factors as they were articulated. Number 1, his deep-rooted resentment of all authority, which was expressed in a hostility toward every society in which he lived. Number 2, his inability to enter into meaningful relationships with people, and a continuous pattern of rejecting his environment in favor of new surroundings. Number 3, his urge to try and find a place in history and despair at times over failures in his various undertakings. Number 4, his capacity for violence as evidenced by his attempt to kill General Walker. Number 5, his avowed commitment to Marxism and communism as he understood the terms and developed his own interpretation of them. This was expressed by his antagonism toward the United States. Well, a closer look at the Warren Report's 5 factors which might have influenced his decision, as they put it, to kill Kennedy shows that most of them are contradicted by the evidence. But the one we are dealing with today is number 4, and that one relates to the prior act of attempting to kill General Edwin Walker as a good indicator of his willingness to engage in violence, an implied willingness to repeat himself and perpetrate the act of assassination, but this time on the President of the United States. Okay, let's try to do this in the right order. Let's start, as I said a few minutes ago, with reading the Walker incident first, as it was set forth in the FBI summary report that was prepared in early December 1963, in those few short weeks following the assassination. You know, you may wonder how shooting at Walker, a shooting that happens in April 1963 and goes unsolved for about 7 months, suddenly gets tagged to Oswald after he is tagged with the assassination of the president. That part of the story relates to a note written by Oswald purportedly found at the Ruth Paine residence among the Oswald's belongings, and the subsequent corroboration through testimony by Marina about the interaction she had with Lee the night of the Walker shooting. Well, let's hear what the actual FBI report said. Section G, Prior Similar Act. Mrs. Marina Oswald was interviewed on December 3, 1963 by the FBI concerning an undated note which was called to the attention of the FBI the same day. According to Mrs. Oswald, this note, which was written in Russian, was found by her one night last spring in a room where her husband kept his things at their residence at 214 West Neely Street, Dallas. On that night, Oswald told her he was going to attend a typewriting class at an evening school in Dallas. He came rushing into the house around midnight, very pale and agitated. Mrs. Oswald asked what was wrong, and he replied that he had tried to kill General Walker by shooting him with a rifle, and he did not know if he had hit him. At this time, Oswald told her that General Walker was the leader of the fascists in Dallas, and it was necessary to remove him. Mrs. Oswald said she thought the rifle used by her husband to shoot at General Walker and the rifle he kept in Mrs. Payne's garage in Irving, Texas, were one and the same. Mrs. Oswald said she kept the note written in Russian by Oswald, which was evidently a farewell letter, and threatened Oswald with going to the police with the letter if he ever planned on another such crazy scheme. She advised that as a result of this incident, she insisted that they move from Dallas. The writing on this note has been identified by the FBI laboratory as being handwriting of Lee Harvey Oswald. It is noted that former Major General Edwin A. Walker resides in Dallas, and a rifle bullet was shot through the window of his home on April 10, 1963, narrowly missing General Walker. The person firing the shot was never identified. Investigation showed that Mr. and Mrs. Oswald resided at 214 West Neely Street in Dallas during April 1963 and left that address on April 24, 1963, when they moved to New Orleans. At that time, in April 1963, Oswald was renting a small mailbox with number 2915 at the main post office on Irving Street in Dallas, which he relinquished as of May 14th. 1963. In this note, Oswald also mentioned you and the baby. In April 1963, Mrs. Oswald had one child, and the second child was born October 20th, 1963. The bullet which fired into General Walker's house on April 10th, 1963, was recovered by the Dallas Police Department. Examination of this bullet by the FBI laboratory disclosed that While the bullet is extremely distorted and mutilated, it has the general characteristics of those bullets fired from the 6.5 millimeter Mannlicher Carcano rifle belonging to Oswald. This rifle was found in the Texas School Book Depository building following the assassination of President Kennedy. Because of the mutilation of this bullet, and because the gun barrel may have changed since April 10, 1963, it was not possible to determine whether or not this bullet was fired from Oswald's rifle. Well, there you have it. Even the FBI, right then, as hard as they were bending in to try to get the narrative right, they couldn't connect Oswald's rifle with the shot that was fired at General Walker. More to come on that. Now, the strongest evidence offered up by the Warren Commission is the fact that Marina had conversations with Lee about this topic, the shooting, and to be precise, an interaction the night of the shooting. But wait a minute, let's put this in context as well. Ostensibly, for her safety, after the assassination, the Secret Service took Marina to places not disclosed at the time and put her in hiding. But truly, they were interested in interrogating her to find out more. That seems pretty reasonable. But the ground rules under which they did it were, let's say, pretty flimsy. In retrospect, it was not a fair game. For more than 2 months after the JFK assassination, Marina Oswald was held at the inn of the Six Flags in Arlington, near Fort Worth, where the Secret Service and the FBI interrogated her and threatened her with deportation to the Soviet Union. That is a fact, and it's right there in the Warren Commission report. They were unabashed about that little fact about the interrogation tactic. The point being that under duress, during the interrogation, surely under duress, Marina produced several statements incriminating to her husband, including the claim that on the evening of the attempted assassination of General Walker, Lee Oswald had gone out, leaving a handwritten note which explained in Russian what she should do if he were arrested. When Lee returned, he admitted to Marina that he had shot at Walker. Marina's account of that incident is also in the Warren report. The prime piece of evidence against Oswald was his own wife's testimony. But here is the thing. Marina's credibility during that time frame was compromised for many reasons, including the interrogation tactics and the threat of deportation that I have just mentioned. And it was pretty clear to the Warren Commission lawyers that she had made many contradictory and unreliable statements. Whether the language barrier and interpretation were any part of it, well, it's hard to tell. But in any case, the attorneys characterized these differences as downright lies. One of the commission's attorneys, Norman Redlich, wrote in a memo to J. Lee Rankin that, and I quote, "Neither you nor I have any desire to smear the reputation of an individual. But we cannot ignore, however, that Marina Oswald has repeatedly lied to the Secret Service, the FBI, and this commission on matters which are of vital concern to the people of this country and the world." Redlich expanded on this when testifying before the HSCA. In a quote from him, he would say, "She may not have told the truth in connection with the attempted killing of General Walker." Redlich was so concerned about this during the Warren Commission review that he gave J. Lee Rankin a lengthy document, one which indicated the testimony that Marina had given and the instances where it was in conflict. One of the prominent examples of lying was contained in one of her earliest statements to the FBI and the Secret Service. Marina claimed that Oswald had not practiced firing a rifle, but she later changed her mind and told her interrogators what they wanted to hear. "I said before I had never seen it before, but I think you understand. I want to help you, and that is why there is no reason for concealing anything. I will not be charged with anything." She then told the FBI that Oswald had practiced with his rifle in January 1963. On learning that Oswald had not, in fact, bought the rifle until 2 months later, she admitted that she had been mistaken and that she only deduced that he might have been practicing with the rifle. The Warren Commission relied on Marina Oswald's statements, despite being aware that they were contradictory and unreliable. Now, it's time to tell you a little bit about who General Edwin Walker was before we dive into the details of that night, the details of the shooting and supposed note left by Oswald. Edwin Walker was born in Kerr County, Texas in 1909, and putting him at 54 years of age at the point of the assassination. He graduated from the New Mexico Military Institute in 1927. This was followed by attendance at West Point. And there, as an officer, he saw action during World War II, where Walker commanded a joint Canadian-American commando team in Italy. After World War II ended, Walker would remain in Europe where, in 1947, he would help the monarchists defeat communist insurgents during the Greek Civil War. Walker also saw action in the Korean War, and on his return to the United States, he became commander of the Arkansas Military District in Little Rock. Now, let's turn to Walker as a major participant in one of the most important civil rights events of the 1950s, one that would shape his thinking and, unfortunately, embolden him to go farther to the right. On September 3, 1957, the governor of Arkansas, Orville Phobos, used the National Guard to stop black children from attending the local high school in Little Rock. We all know the story generally. Well, Woodrow Mann, the reforming mayor of the city, disagreed with this decision, and the next day, on September 4th, he telegraphed President Dwight Eisenhower, and he asked the president to send federal troops to Little Rock to defend the desegregation effort. That prompted President Dwight Eisenhower to go on television the night of September 24th and make the following statement to the American people. At a time when we face grave situations abroad because of the hatred that communism bears towards a system of government based on human rights, it would be difficult to exaggerate the harm that is being done to the prestige and the influence, and indeed to the safety of our nation and the world. Our enemies are gloating over this incident and using it everywhere to misrepresent our whole nation. We are portrayed as a violator of those standards which the peoples of the world united to proclaim in the Charter of the United Nations. After trying for 18 days to persuade the good governor to obey the ruling of the Supreme Court, Eisenhower decided to order paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division to protect black children going to Little Rock Central High School. The white population of Little Rock were furious. They were furious that they were being forced to integrate their school, and Phobos described the federal troops as an army of occupation. There was just 8 African American students entering the high school, but their presence was thunderous. One of those students was Elizabeth Eckford, along with Carlotta Walls, Jefferson Thomas, Thelma Mothershed, Melba Patillo, Ernest Green, Terrence Roberts, Gloria Ray, and Menician Brown. Those 8 kids suffered physical violence and racial abuse that was no less than shameful. And parents of 4 of those children lost their jobs because they stood up and agreed with and got behind the idea of their children attending a previously all-white school. Woodrow Mann himself and his family received death threats from the Ku Klux Klan. Crosses were burned on his front lawn. It's hard to believe that all this took place less than 65 years ago. Why am I telling this story now, and how does it have relevance to the Walker and Oswald circumstance? Well, Walker was a supporter of the John Birch Society, and in fact, a member, and he was totally opposed to school desegregation. However, as commander of the Arkansas Military District, he was forced to implement the orders of Dwight Eisenhower. To him, the assignment was more than distasteful. He took the experience with him back to Europe, and he thought about the impact of soldiers and their thinking when placed in those circumstances. By that time, in October 1959, Edwin Walker was a major general, and he was appointed commander of the 24th Infantry Division in Europe, stationed in Augsburg, Germany. He was getting bolder in his efforts to use his military position to influence military personnel and to extend his extreme right-wing thinking into the military. In April 1961, Walker was accused of indoctrinating his troops with right-wing literature from the John Birch Society. Well, even then, in that era, that was a no-no. So, with the agreement of President John F. Kennedy, Defense Secretary Robert S. McNamara relieved Walker of his command, and they announced an investigation into the affair. Kennedy was accused of trying to suppress the anti-communist feelings of the military. Walker resigned from the Army in protest about the way he had been treated. In September 1961, Walker organized the protests against the enrollment of James Meredith at the University of Mississippi. Another incident the following year resulted in 2 reporters being killed. The administration had had enough. Attorney General Robert Kennedy responded by issuing a warrant for Walker's arrest on the charges of seditious conspiracy, insurrection, and rebellion. This whole series of events was galvanizing for Walker on the right-wing political scene. Walker now became a leading figure in the fight against what he considered to be the liberal establishment. Based in Dallas, he gave many speeches around the country denouncing communism and liberalism. In February 1962, Walker stood for governor of Texas. Although he gained support of Barry Goldwater, another conservative, he finished dead last, and John Connally went on to be governor. So you can see now, by way of background, that Walker was an ultra-conservative right-wing activist with significant high-level military ties and a developing statewide and really national reputation, and a John Bircher right there in Dallas to boot. He hated commies, and he hated liberals, so to speak. I'm not sure that you would call him an equal hate guy, but he had a lot of hate to go around. The story of Edwin Walker concludes on episode 114. Thank you for listening to episode 113 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. Welcome to JFK and the Enduring Secret. I'm your host, Jeff Crudell. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Episode 114 is a continuation of what we started in episode 113. This is the rest of the story of General Edwin Walker and the attempt on his life in Dallas. So, without further ado, let's listen to episode 114 of JFK, The Enduring Secret.
Came in through statements attributed to Lee Oswald's wife, who is still in seclusion, being questioned further by federal authorities. She's reported to have told them that one night last April, Oswald returned home and boasted that he had shot at Walker. There was such a shooting last April. That much is fact. Here is a police officer that night who rushed to Walker's home. He's examining the hole made in a window frame of Walker's second-floor study. The general was sitting at his desk making out his income tax return. The bullet missed his head by inches, bore through a 9-inch wall, and settled in the adjoining room. Walker was spattered by wood and glass splinters, but not seriously hurt. Police, here searching the yard the following morning, determined the bullet came from a high-powered rifle not more than 75 yards away. Just who fired it is not yet proven. Here's what Walker said at the time.
And this is just further indications that there is a threat to our individual rights and liberties.
That was Walker last April 11th, the morning after the apparent attempt on his life. He is quoted now as saying he knew nothing about Oswald until Oswald was arrested in the killing of President Kennedy 2 weeks ago. Oswald's mother said today she knew of no connection between her son and General Walker. The mother also vowed her son's grave would not be moved, despite threats it might be desecrated. Meanwhile, the investigations continue, but the State Court of Inquiry has been postponed until the Presidential Commission finishes its work.
He apparently went on a reconnaissance mission to General Walker's house and scouted the alley in the back.
Oswald had an entire book of operations for his Walker action, including photographs of Walker's house, photographs of an area that he intended to stash the rifle, maps that he had drawn very carefully, statements of political purpose. In the end, he wanted this to be an important historical feat, and this was to be the documentation left behind. He viewed General Walker as an up-and-coming Adolf Hitler, and that he would be the hero who stopped him on his rise to power.
Someone fired a single shot through the window of General Walker's study.
Looking the situation over, back there 40 steps behind me is
General Walker survived to tell what happened.
A bullet crashed through the window and just missed me. And it felt much grit and dirt in my hair. And my arm was laying on the desk, and it was bleeding in 3 places, which turned out to be fragments from the shell casing.
Without going into any detail yet and giving you a tidbit more on a wander, I will say this. Walker was not far away in connection from H.L. Hunt, the uber-conservative and uber-rich Texan who had no use for Kennedy or other liberals. There is supposition that much of the money to fund Walker's failed gubernatorial race was funneled through an anti-Castro Cuban named Felipe Vidal Santiago. We will tie some of these characters together in later episodes, but that's all for now on this little mini wander. Back to Oswald and Walker. So in trying to connect the dots on why on the earth would Oswald want to shoot Walker, why would Walker be the one target, the first target? Well, the obvious and plausible motive for Oswald shooting at Walker, I guess the obvious reason if you are a supporter of the Warren Commission narrative, is that it was political. Walker was well known for his very right-wing views. He had been forced to resign from the Army for indoctrinating his troops with the ideas of the John Birch Society and for announcing publicly that President Truman, among other prominent American politicians, was a communist sympathizer. Oh, and after all, Oswald was nothing more than a communist and a Marxist, right? Look, I think it's important to bring the facts a little closer to home here, so I think it's time for another slight wander. Okay, what is that wander? Well, I'm going to read now the entire Warren Commission testimony of Marina Oswald as she was questioned about the Walker incident by Warren Commission ranking attorney J. Lee Rankin. To put the start of the conversation in context, the Oswalds were living on Neely Street at the time of the shooting. I know this may sound a little silly, but there are only 2 people in this deposition, and one of them is Marina. So, I will play both parts with my own voice and use a ridiculously bad Russian accent to portray when Marina is talking in order for you all in the listening audience to be able to differentiate between the 2 participants. So, here we go. Did you ever observe that rifle had been taken out of the apartment at Neely Street? That is, that it was gone? Before the incident with General Walker, I know that Lee was preparing for something. He took photographs of that house, and he told me not to enter his room. I don't know about these photographs, but when I came into the room once in general, he tried to make it so that I would spend less time in that room. I noticed that quite accidentally one time. When I was cleaning the room, he tried to take care of it himself. I asked him what kind of photographs are these, but he didn't say anything to me. That is the photographs of the Walker house that you were asking about. Yes, later, after he had fired, he told me about it. I didn't know that he intended to do it, that he was planning to do it. Did you learn at any time that he had been practicing with the rifle? I think that he went once or twice. I didn't actually see him take the rifle, but I knew that he was practicing. Could you give us a little help on how you knew? He told me, and he would mention that in passing. It isn't as if he said, well, today I am going, it wasn't if he said, well, today I'm going to take the rifle and go and practice. But he would say, well, today I will take the rifle along for practice. Therefore, I don't know whether he took it from the house or whether perhaps he even kept the rifle somewhere outside. There was a little square, sort of a little courtyard, where he might have kept it. When you asked me about the rifle, I said that Lee didn't have a rifle, but he also had a gun, a revolver. Do you recall when he first had the pistol that you remember? He had that on Neely Street, but I think that he acquired the rifle before he acquired the pistol. The pistol I saw twice. Once in his room and the second time when I took these photographs. What period of time was there between when he got the rifle and you learned of it and the time that you first learned about the pistol? I can't say. When you testified about his practicing with a rifle, are you describing a period when you were still at Neely Street? Yes. Do you know where he practiced with a rifle? I don't know where. I don't know the name of the place where this took place, but I think it was somewhere out of town. It seems to me a place called Love Field. Would that be at the airport? Love Field? Love Field. So you think he was practicing out in the open and not at a rifle range? Yes. Do you recall seeing the rifle when the telescopic lens was on it? I hadn't paid any attention initially. I know a rifle was a rifle. I didn't know whether or not it had the telescope attached to it, but the first I remember seeing it was in New Orleans, where I recognized the telescope. But probably the telescope was on before. I simply hadn't paid attention. I hope you understand. When I saw it, I thought that all rifles have that. Did you make any objection to having the rifle around? Of course. What did he say to that? For a man to have a rifle, since I am a woman, I don't understand him, and I shouldn't bother him. A fine life. Is that the same rifle that you are referring to that you took the picture of with your husband and when he had the pistol too? Yes. I asked him then why he had dressed himself up like that with the rifle and the pistol, and I thought that he had gone crazy and that he said he wanted to send that to a newspaper. This was not my business. It was man's business. If I had known these were such dangerous toys, of course, you understand that I thought that Lee had changed in that direction, and I didn't think it was a serious occupation with him just playing around. Do you recall the day that you took the picture of him with the rifle and the pistol? I think that was towards the end of February, possibly the beginning of March. I can't say exactly because I didn't attach any significance to it at the time. That was the only time I took any pictures. I don't know how to take pictures. He gave me a camera and asked me someone should ask me how to photograph. I don't know. Was it on a day off that you took the picture? It was on a Sunday. How did it occur? Did he come to you and ask you to take the picture? I was hanging up diapers and he came up to me with the rifle and I was even a little scared. And he gave me the camera and asked me to press a certain button. And he was dressed up with a pistol at the same time, was he? Yes. You have examined that picture since and noticed that the telescopic lens was on at the time the picture was taken, have you not? Now I paid attention to it. A specialist would see it immediately, of course, but at that time I did not pay any attention at all. I just saw Lee. These details are of great significance for everybody, but for me at that time it didn't mean anything. At the time that I was questioned, I had even forgotten that I had taken 2 photographs. I thought there was only one. I thought that there were 2 identical pictures, but they turned out to be 2 different poses. Did you have anything to do with the prints, the photograph after the prints were made? That is, did you put them in a photographic album yourself? Lee gave me one photograph and asked me to keep it for June somewhere. Of course, June doesn't need photographs like that. Do you recall how long after that the Walker matter occurred? 2, perhaps 3 weeks later. I don't know. You know better when this happened. How did you first learn that your husband had shot at General Walker? That evening, he went out. I thought he had gone to his classes, or perhaps that he had just walked out or went out on his own business. It got to be about 10 or 10:30. He was not home yet. I began to be worried, perhaps even later. Then I went into his room. Somehow I was drawn into it. I was pacing around. Then I saw a note there. Did you look for the gun at that time? No, I didn't understand anything. On the note, it said, "If I am arrested." And there are certain other questions, such as, for example, the key to the mailbox is in such and such a place, and that he left me some money to last me for some time. And I couldn't understand at all what can he be arrested for. When he came back, I asked him what had happened. He was very pale. I don't remember the exact time, but it was very late, and he told me not to ask him any questions. He only told me that he had shot at General Walker. Of course, I didn't sleep all night. I thought that any minute now the police will come. Of course, I wanted to ask him a great deal, but in his state, I decided I had best leave him alone. It would be purposeless to question him. Did he say any more than that about the shooting? Of course, in the morning I told him that I was worried and that we can have lots of trouble, and I asked him, where is the rifle? What did you do with it? He said that he had left it somewhere, that he had buried it, it seems to me, somewhere far from that place, but he said dogs could find it by smell. I don't know. I am not a criminologist. Did he tell you why he had shot at General Walker? I told him that he had no right to kill people in peacetime. He had no right to take their life because not everybody has the same ideas as he has. People cannot be all alike. He said that this was a very bad man, that he was a fascist, that he was the leader of a fascist organization. And when I said that, even though all of that might be true, just the same, he had no right to take his life. He said if someone had killed Hitler in time, it would have saved many lives. I told him that this is no method to prove your ideas by means of a rifle. Did you ask him how long he had been planning to do this? Yes. He said he had been planning for 2 months. Yes, perhaps he had planned to do so even earlier, but according to his conduct, I could tell he was planning. He had been planning this for 2 months, or perhaps a little even earlier. Would you like to take a little recess? No, thank you. Better to get it over with. Did he show you a picture of the Walker house then? Yes. That was after the shooting? Yes. He had a book. He had a notebook in which he noted down quite a few details. It was all in English. I didn't read it, but I noticed a photograph. Sometimes he would lock himself in his room and write in this book. I thought that he was writing some other kind of memoirs, as he had written about his life in the Soviet Union. Did you ever read that book? No. Did you know of anything else he had in it besides this Walker picture? No. Photographs and notes, and I think there was a map in there. There was a map of the area where the Walker house was? It was a map of Dallas, but I don't know where Walker lived. Sometimes evenings he would be busy with this. Perhaps he was calculating something, but I don't know. He had a bus schedule and computed something. After this had happened, people thought that he had a car, but he had been using a bus. Did he explain to you about his being able to use a bus just as well as other people could use a car, something of that kind? No, simply as a passenger. He told me that even before that time he had gone also to shoot, but he had returned. I don't know why. Because on the day that he did fire, there was a church across the street, and there were many people there, and it was easier to merge in the crowd and not be noticed. Did you ask him about this note that he had left, what he meant by it? Yes, he said he had in mind that if in the case he were arrested, I would know what to do. The note doesn't say anything about Walker, does it? No. Did you ask him if that is what he meant by the note? Yes, because as soon as he came home, I showed him the note and asked him, what is the meaning of this? And that is when he gave you the explanation about the Walker shooting. Yes. I know that on Sunday he took the rifle, but I don't think he fired on a Sunday. Perhaps this was on a Friday. So Sunday he left and took the rifle. If the Walker shooting was on Wednesday, does that refresh your memory as to the day of the week at all? Refresh my memory as to what? As to the day of the shooting. Yeah, he was in the middle of the week. Did he give any further explanation of what had happened that evening? Well, when he fired, he did not know whether he had hit Walker or not. He didn't take the bus from there. He ran several kilometers and then he took the bus. And then he turned on the radio and he listened. but there were no reports. The next day, he brought the paper, and there he read that it was only a chance that saved Walker's life. If he had not moved, he might have been killed. Did he comment on that at all? He said only that he had taken very good aim, but that it was just chance that caused him to miss. He was very sorry that he had not hit him. I asked him to give me his word that he would not repeat anything like that. I said that this chance shows that he must live and that he should not be shot at again. I told him that I would save the note and that if something like that should be repeated again, I would go to the police and I would have the proof in the form of that note. He said he would not repeat anything like that again. By the way, several days after that, the Morenschilds came to us, and as soon as he opened the door, he said, "Lee, how is it possible that you missed?" I looked at Lee. I thought that he had told de Morenschild about it, and Lee looked at me, and he apparently thought that I had told de Morenschild about it. It was kind of dark, but I noticed. It was in the evening, but I noticed that his face changed, that he almost became speechless. You see, other people knew my husband better than I did. Not always, but in this case. Was de Morenschild a friend that he told? Your husband told him personal things that you knew of? He asked Lee, not because Lee had told him about it, but I think because he is a smart enough man to have been able to guess it. I don't know. He is simply a liberal. Simply a man. I don't think that he is being accused justly of being a communist. That is de Morenschild that you refer to. Yes. Did you tell the authorities anything about this Walker incident when you learned about it? No. You have told the Secret Service or the FBI reasons why you didn't? Will you tell us? Why I have not tell about it? First, because he was my husband. As far as I know, according to the local laws here, a wife cannot be a witness against her husband. But of course, if I had known that Lee intended to repeat something like that, I would have told. Did he ask you to return the note to him? He forgot about it. But apparently, after he thought that what he had written in his book might be proof against him, and he destroyed it. That is this book that you have just referred to in which he had the Walker house picture. There was a notebook. Yes, that is the one. What did you do with the note that he had left for you after you talked about it and said you were going to keep it? I had it among my things in a cookbook, but I have two. I don't remember in which. Did your relations with your husband change after the Walker incident? Yes. Will you describe to us the changes as you observed them? Well, soon after that, Lee lost his job. I don't know for what reason, but he was upset by it. And he looked for work for several days. And then I insisted that it would be better for him to go to New Orleans, where he had relatives. I insisted on that because I wanted to get him further removed from Dallas and from Walker, because even though he gave me his word, I wanted to have him further away, because a rifle for him was not a very good toy. A toy that was too enticing. Did you say that you wanted him to go to New Orleans because of the Walker incident? No, I simply told him that I wanted to see his hometown. He had been born there. When he promised you that he would not do anything like that again, did you then believe him? I did not quite believe him, inasmuch as the rifle remained in the house. Did you ask him to get rid of the rifle at that time? Yes. After he shot Walker, did you notice his taking the rifle out anymore to practice? No. Do you recall when you went to New Orleans? I think it was in May. Lee went there by himself. At that time, I became acquainted with Mrs. Payne, and I stayed with her while he was looking for work. In about 1 week, Lee telephoned me that he had found a job and that I should come down. When did you first get acquainted with Mrs. Payne? I think it was a couple of months earlier, probably in January. How did you happen to go to Mrs. Payne's house to stay? Did she invite you? Yes, she invited me. I had become acquainted with her through some Russian friends of ours. We had visited with some people, and she was there. Inasmuch as she was studying Russian, she invited me to stay with her. Did you pay her anything for staying with her? No, I only repaid her in the sense that I helped her in the household and that I gave her Russian language lessons. This, in her words, was the very best pay that I could give her. And she wanted that. I remained with her longer. But, of course, it was better for me to be with my husband. How did your husband let you know that he had found a job? He telephoned me. Did you then leave at once for New Orleans? Yes. And how did you get to New Orleans from Dallas? Mrs. Payne took me there in her car. She took her children and my things, and we went there. Did you have much in the way of household goods to move? Oh, everything. We could put everything into one car, but in fact, most of the things Lee had taken with him because he went by bus. Did he take the gun with him to New Orleans? I don't remember exactly, but it seems to me that it was not among my things. Where did you live at in New Orleans? Magazine Street. By the time I arrived there, Lee already had rented an apartment. When Mrs. Payne brought you down to New Orleans, did she stay with you for any period of time? Yes, she was there for 2 days. How did Mrs. Payne and your husband get along? Were they friendly? She was very good to us, to Lee and to me, and Lee was quite friendly with her, but he did not like her. I know that he did not like her. Did he tell you why he didn't like her? He considered her to be a stupid woman. Excuse me, these are not my words. Were you and Mrs. Payne good friends? Yes, so. I tried to help her as much as I could, but I also, I did not like her too well. I also considered her not to be a very smart woman. I think it is about time for recess, Mr. Chairman. Very well, we'll take a recess for 10 minutes. Mrs. Oswald, did you discuss the Walker shooting with Mrs. Payne? No, I didn't tell anyone, apart from the FBI. That is after. That is later. When was it that you told the FBI about the Walker shooting? About 2 weeks after Lee was killed. Okay, we can stop there. That was illuminating, wasn't it? Now, why don't we pivot to a little more about the details of the shooting and the crime itself? No one saw the gun being shot. There were no witnesses that night that actually saw a shot being taken. However, there was a witness to the shooting scene. Walter Kirk Coleman, who was a neighbor of General Walker's, heard the gunshot and saw 2 men making their escape, and one stopped to play something in the back of his Ford sedan. Then the 2 men both drove off, but they did so separately in different cars. Now, here is a tidbit for you. It is widely believed that, at the time, Oswald could not drive. He did not know how to drive. And this has raised serious doubts about whether he could have been involved in this attempt on Walker's life, based on the getaway of the 2 men, as witnessed by the neighbor. Coleman was able to give detailed descriptions of the men and their cars. After the JFK assassination, Coleman was shown photographs of Oswald. He denied that Oswald resembled either of the men he had seen. Robert Surrey, an associate of General Walker, reported that he had seen 2 men acting suspiciously outside Walker's house 2 days before the shooting. And in that case, as well, neither of those men resembled Oswald. After the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, the photo of General Walker's home that was mentioned already in Marina Oswald's Warren Commission testimony was found among Oswald's possessions. When the photograph was turned over to the Warren Commission by the FBI, a hole had been pushed through it right in the spot where the license plate on the car had been, making the car unidentifiable. It was a car that was later confirmed to not belong to Walker. Another photograph taken by the Dallas police showed Oswald's possessions laid out on the floor of police headquarters. This included the photograph of Walker's home, but it was without the hole obscuring the license plate. Isn't that interesting? Another great example of evidence destruction in the case. But for what reason? Who owned that car? And if Oswald was with someone and took the photo, would they be stupid enough to take a picture of the car they drove in? Probably not. I bet someone at the police station figured out who it was, someone who wanted to keep their right-wing sentiments out of the paper, and asked someone else to poke a hole in it. But I'm just saying. Man, you can't write this stuff. Now, let's turn back for a minute to the note that was written in Russian that Marina mentioned in her testimony. The one that Lee left in case he was arrested. Over the years, there have been questions as to whether it was real or not, or truly meant what it implied to be through Marina's testimony. Well, here are some facts to chew on. The note was undated and did not mention General Walker or any reason why Oswald might find himself under arrest. There are several reasons to doubt the authenticity of the handwritten note. Ruth Payne's home had been searched thoroughly on the afternoon of the assassination and again the following day when Payne claimed to have seen officers specifically looking for loose papers within books. The inventory of items discovered is 49 pages long, but it never mentions the note. Once they had the note in hand, the FBI's handwriting expert considered that the note was in Oswald's handwriting. But that whole topic was revisited as part of the HSCA review in 1978. And this time around, only one of the three experts who were consulted by the House Select Committee on Assassinations considered the note to be authentic. Two of the three did not. That is a real moment of pause for me. The FBI's fingerprint expert found 7 sets of prints on the note. And do you know, none of them belonged to either Lee or Marina Oswald. Was it just too long since they had touched the note? Were the prints too latent? This too seems dubious. And in any case, with 7 sets of prints, isn't there a reasonable chance that some of them were investigators' prints? Geez, they were sloppy then, weren't they? Finally, let's say a few words about the bullet found at the scene, the single shot that was taken and fired at General Walker. The bottom line is that if it was Lee Harvey Oswald, he probably was using someone else's rifle, or had another rifle that no one has ever found. Why would I say this? Well, the bullet used in the attempted shooting of Walker was probably not the same type as those that were recovered as evidence in the JFK assassination, and the bullet that was recovered was very badly damaged. According to various newspaper accounts, including one in the New York Times on April 12th, the Dallas police claimed that the bullet was a .30-06 caliber. And that is different than the ammunition used by the Mannlicher Carcano, which supposedly was the gun that Lee Harvey Oswald fired from up on the Texas School Book Depository. That gun uses a 6.5 millimeter shell. The Walker bullet was too severely deformed to allow a conclusive analysis of its pattern of grooves. Oh, and there is one more thing. A spectrographic examination by Henry Heilberger of the FBI lab found that the lead alloy in the bullet was different from that of bullet fragments found in President Kennedy's car. But wait a minute. There is yet another test that perhaps ties the bullets together. Okay, we are back to the usual confusion in this case. Okay, so tell me, what was it? Well, Dr. Vincent Gunn performed neutron activation analysis on the bullet fired at General Walker, and he performed the same test on several bullet fragments associated with the JFK assassination. He claimed that the Walker bullet was extremely likely to be a fragment from the same type of bullet as those fired at President Kennedy. Okay. I guess it sounds like the new science is winning. They're a match now. Okay, is that it? Is that where we are at? Well, yes, but not for long. As we heard on other episodes, the FBI's application of neutron activation analysis has since been proven faulty, and this basic methodology and results that were performed on these bullets has since been refuted. So I guess we're back to, no, there's not a match. And look, there are other obvious forensic points related to the ammunition used in the Walker shooting. The Walker bullet was fired from a rifle powerful enough to send it through brickwork, which the Mannlicher Carcano rifle was not. There is no evidence that Oswald ever had access to such a rifle. Not only did the bullet and rifle have no association with Lee Harvey Oswald, but Edwin Walker was adamant that Commission Exhibit 573, the bullet offered into evidence as the one recovered from the Walker shooting scene, was not the one General Walker had examined at the time of the shooting. This disturbed Walker enough that there is correspondence between him and the Justice Department Criminal Division on this topic. More evidence of evidence tampering? Geez, like I said, you really can't make this stuff up. So in the end, it's kind of a coin toss, just like in the case of the Kennedy assassination as a whole. no one saw Oswald or anyone that looked remotely like Oswald at the scene. The bullets are different. Likely, at least possibly, there is dubious evidence about whether the note is real and that it may have been planted since it didn't get picked up in the original inventory. And subsequent HSCA handwriting analysis has a majority of experts saying he didn't even write it. It's not in Oswald's handwriting. And then, what is a picture of Walker's home doing in his belongings? Could that have been planted in light of the questions about the note? All right, stop being paranoid. But then you have Marina telling her story, and if she is not lying, well, then it's true. He did it. She saw the note that night. He had the conversations about it with her. How much more do you need? Back and forth. Wait a minute. She was held by the Secret Service for 2 months in a hotel room and intensely interrogated and threatened with deportation using totally inappropriate interview techniques on a witness. Oh, geez. Well, as a juror, you have a lot to take in here. I don't know about you, but it's getting late here, and I think it's time for a sandwich. Oh, before I go, there's a little P.S. on the good general. General Walker himself pointed out that the bullet which had almost killed him was not the same type as the bullets fired in the JFK assassination and thus cannot have been fired from the only rifle which could be attributed to Oswald. Walker also claimed that the bullet which the Warren Commission entered into evidence was not the bullet he had handed them at the time of the shooting. In 1975, Harry Dean claimed that he had been an undercover agent for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. In 1962, he infiltrated the John Birch Society. He later reported that Walker and John Rousselat had hired 2 gunmen, Eladio Del Valle and Lauren Hall, to kill President John F. Kennedy. However, Dean was unable to provide any evidence to back up his claim. On June 23, 1976, Walker was arrested for public lewdness in a public toilet at a Dallas park and accused of fondling an undercover policeman. He was arrested again for a similar offense on the 16th of March, 1977. He pled guilty and was given a suspended 30-day jail sentence and fined $1,000. Edwin Walker died of lung disease in Dallas on October 31, 1993. The ultra-right-wing elements of our society continue to honor him in various ways. He was a folk hero of sorts in the right-wing community. The Major General Edwin A. Walker Society was started in 1999 as a closed anti-communist association of active duty and retired officers and non-commissioned officers who have taken upon themselves the mission of combating the communist forces of cultural Marxism, multiculturalism, the United Nations, and Bolshevist influences in the military. Thank you for listening to episode 114 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. Welcome to JFK and the Enduring Secret. I'm your host, Jeff Crudell. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is episode 115. Well, with the help of my good friend Bill, who is an ardent listener to the podcast, I settled in on where we are going next in the story that is JFK, The Enduring Secret. I wish that all we had to do was to keep roaming around in Dealey Plaza or inside or around the Dowtex building or follow the trail somewhere into Oak Cliff. And then, miraculously, that is all that would be required to eventually find the answer to this mystery. But this story is much bigger than all of that, and we all know it. In one of the earlier episodes of our podcast, we talked a little bit about the predominant conspiracy themes that exist today. Without trying to dive in as to which one is correct or not, or whether any of them are correct, you first have to get up above it all and have some perspective on the history of the 20th century. For anyone who has followed a good part of this podcast, you know I love history. And there is perhaps no time in man's existence, no 100-year period in the last 5,000 years of man's existence on this earth that have been so packed with so much in the way of extraordinary events. And the world is moving so rapidly, moving forward so rapidly, that here we are in year 2022, and it's hard to believe that some of these themes that I'm about to speak to you about were so predominant in the decades before and after the JFK assassination. But they were. And some of them, perhaps many of them in some ways, still dominate. What am I talking about? Well, let's just spend a few minutes on what really comprises the overarching theme of the 20th century. And that is the theme related to war and destruction. For it truly defined the first half of the 20th century, and its reach carried far into the second half of the century as well, provided the launching pad that allowed the formation of the CIA and its overarching potential, and the looming impact of war allowed the CIA to become what it did. And war of any kind makes for odd alliances as we explore the existence of the mafia and how it became intertwined with the CIA and with the trade unions, and one of those moments where common enemies make for strange bedfellows. Yes, it's true, you really can't write this stuff. It is truth that is more interesting and more far out than fiction. It reads better than an Ian Fleming spy novel or a Godfather movie segment. And to understand the historical underpinnings of the 20th century is to equip ourselves for the rest of the story that we are going to tell about the JFK assassination. We may not solve the crime by telling this story, or stories actually, and some folks may even call it a wander with no real significance related to who killed the president. In the end, I will leave that judgment up to you. I doubt you will say it is insignificant. You will likely say it was interesting. Well, I think that's what you might say. It's really hard to believe that our government would be so engaged and so intertwined in all of these dubious ways. But the world was a rapidly changing place and getting more complex by the moment. Maybe tragic circumstances like the death camps at Auschwitz should remind us of the universal brutality of man. Yet there was still an element of innocence and trust that underscored our country in the late 1940s and 1950s and really well into the 1960s. So without getting too off track, let's get back to the mega themes that shaped everything else. Like I said, the overarching theme of war and destruction was at the forefront. So let's start with World War II. It was the largest and most deadly war that has been waged in the history of the world. It truly was the crescendo of a series of military confrontations that began early in the 20th century in many parts of the globe, and certainly was irrevocably connected to the aftermath of World War I, and the onerous terms under which Germany was required to surrender and make reparations. But it wasn't just the German conflict that caused all of this. Without going into the details of the war itself, there were several overarching themes that came out of World War II. The first, of course, was the massive loss of human life on a scale that has never been seen on this planet up to that time, and hopefully will never occur again. Official estimates of the casualty losses have actually changed dramatically over the years, and the method of measurement and the period of time measured has also contributed to those changes. But regardless of how you get to the numbers, the latest loss estimates indicate that perhaps some 80 million human lives were lost as a result of this all-out physical war. Now that number should be almost unfathomable to any of us. As many of you know who have listened to the podcast all the way through, I have my own tragic story, losing my oldest son some 6 years ago. My loss, as tragic as it was and is just an N of 1 when compared to what happened in World War II. There were 80 million N's of 1 in that war. Why I am starting with a loss of life is twofold. First, human destruction on that scale, at least to some, creates a level of numbness for those who are exposed to it. I guess in a way it both heightens and cheapens the value of a human life for the populace as a whole who are living in that era. You are left with a society where some are unequivocally prepared to kill or be killed because they see the existence and the essence of pure evil. After all, how can 80 million lives be obliterated from this earth without there being some level of evil around it? Whether it was the evil that started it, or the evil that finished it, or the evil that met in between. The killing of man evokes the timeless moral question that inevitably comes with the assessment of war, and man's inability to settle differences without using war as a primordial tool of existence. The second theme related to World War II is that while it might have emasculated, finally, the German grievances and the Japanese grievances, what it then brought on was a circumstance that truly began to split the world into two brand new and very opposing camps. During the war, the U.S. had been uneasy allies with the Russians. The truth is that the Russians were in the war before we were, and that impacted the scale of human suffering and loss of life which the Russians experienced, compared to the Americans. The war had already escalated exponentially for them before that occurred for us. The Russians wanted us in the war much earlier than we got in, and for that, they were quick to blame us for their losses, and they were quick to physically commandeer much of the conquered territory toward the end of the war, and they did so as a down payment from the West for the price that Russia had paid during the war. The uneasy alliance between these two great powers, America and Russia, that emerged during the war to defeat Hitler and Japan was to fall apart after the war and create the next phase of tension in the world, the Cold War, which is our next big theme. The Cold War was an ideological battle on its most fundamental level of good versus evil. And who was good and who was evil was defined by both sides for their own proprietary purposes. It was propaganda at its finest by everyone involved. And in the simplest of terms, it was a question of whether our fundamental founding principles would prevail. Republics, where the power was intrinsically retained by the people and whose democratic societies assured representative government with an emphasis on personal liberties. It was all that versus the concept of communism. The state first as the organism of being, or the individual first as the organism of being. And like the movies of the day, it seemed to everyone on both sides to be a black and white issue, open and shut. Most folks simply framed it up as capitalism versus communism, the simple proxy statement setting forth the differences. So the next few episodes are history lessons of sorts, and it will be a mixture of me and a mixture of good clips from shows that have done a nice job summarizing the points that I hope we all can level set with once we wander through all the history lessons that I have planned. We'll start to get into the details related to the assassination that involved the CIA, the Cubans, and the mob, and maybe even a little bit more than that. I promise it's fascinating, and it's a fascinating yet tragic part of our country's history. So without further ado, let's start by listening to this excellent discussion of the start of the Cold War that was done on the series named Timeline. And this particular episode was narrated by the notoriously conservative actor Charlton Heston. Despite his own political leanings, I think this segment is very well done. I hope you think so too. So, without further ado, let's listen to episode 115 of JFK, The Enduring Secret.
By 1945, the world was tired of war. the Axis powers had been defeated and to a large extent destroyed. But as the victors divided the spoils, new conflicts emerged among former allies. At the heart of these disagreements were the fundamental differences between the Soviet Union and the United States. One was communist, the other capitalist. In the Eastern system, the interests of the state were preeminent. The Western system emphasized the rights of the individual. Neither side trusted the other, yet neither side wanted a final confrontation.
An incubus sort of remained over Europe for many years after World War II, which was the belief by many military men that one day the Russians would suddenly make a move and head for the English Channel.
This state of perpetual tension was called the Cold War. Now, in the second half of the 20th century, the United States and the Soviet Union set their intelligence services against each other in a secret and deadly game of global one-upsmanship. How many weapons did the other side have? What did they plan to do with them? Not knowing bred fear and anxiety. Not knowing drove each to build more and bigger weapons of mass destruction, racing to be ready for the day when the other would show its hand. Intelligence became the world's most precious commodity. Intelligence gathering the world's most dangerous profession. For the United States, that job fell to the men and women of the Central Intelligence Agency. At the outset of World War II, the Soviet Union was the largest country on Earth, covering 1/7 of the planet's surface. By 1946, having absorbed territories previously held by Germany and Japan, the communist nation now controlled 1/6 of the planet. Western leaders had good reason to believe that the Soviets wanted more. Only months after the Yalta Agreement, Premier Joseph Stalin had publicly declared that the world was too small to peacefully contain both communism and capitalism. War between the systems, the Russian dictator said, was inevitable. The United States brought World War II to an abrupt end with the atomic bomb. Western strategists now believed they at least held that trump card against Soviet aggression. Then, 1 week after Stalin's ominous prediction, a ring of Russian spies was caught stealing atomic secrets in Canada. The idea that the Russians might be close to building the bomb sent a shudder throughout the free world. On February 26, 1946, George Kennan, an American diplomat in Moscow and longtime Soviet observer, sent a secret yet lengthy message to his superiors in the U.S. State Department.
It's known as the Long Telegram. It was described in considerable detail the Russian system, where they came from, how they reacted, how they wanted to do business, and it jolted people.
The 8,000-word message described America's former allies as a genuine and highly aggressive threat to the West. The Soviet economic system was internally weak, the message went on, and therefore it was essential for their survival that they be an aggressor. The Soviet-style communist system needed to acquire and exploit satellite countries in order to survive. They could not and would not stop short of total world domination. Kennan's message caused a sensation in Washington. President Harry Truman, his cabinet and military leaders all read the telegram. Truman was already concerned with Soviet expansionism and inclined to agree with Kennan's assessment. If the Western way of life was to survive, the Soviets would have to be contained. The United States, the president knew, was the only country in the world strong enough to stand up to Russia. But in order to do this, they would need to know how strong the Soviets were and be able to predict their next move. In 1945, with the war over, President Harry Truman had disbanded the United States Foreign Intelligence Service, the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS. Now, in the face of this new threat, Truman resurrected the idea of a civilian intelligence gathering agency. On July 25, 1947, he signed the National Security Act, creating the Central Intelligence Agency. The new agency was staffed almost entirely by veterans of the OSS. The first 4 directors would be military men. George Kennan's message had called for containment of Soviet aggression, but leadership at the new intelligence agency disagreed with that policy. The best defense, they maintained, was a strong offense. It was time to bring back some of the dirty tricks the OSS had developed in World War II.
There were sort of 2 worlds of intelligence. One was intelligence gathering, traditional spies, people who meet you on park benches and try to steal documents. That was one side. The other side was covert action, which was much more aggressive, overthrowing a government, staging a coup d'etat. Or it would be psychological warfare, sending out disinformation. Covert action is riskier, there's a higher return.
Once the Cold War starts, both sides realize that there's going to be a lot of back alley action. It's going to be things happening that are not going to be on the front page of Pravda or the New York Times.
On June 18, 1948, with the endorsement of President Truman, a secret and autonomous branch of the CIA was born. It was called the OPC.
Office of Policy Coordination was a wonderfully benign name to throw people off the idea that really it was the Department of Dirty Tricks. They were the covert operators. They were the hardball types who wanted to jump behind enemy lines and get behind the Iron Curtain.
The ultimate mission of the CIA and the OPC was to subvert the Russian hold on Eastern Europe. But in 1948, there were more immediate concerns. The Communist Party had built a strong presence in Italy, and the new agency feared the leftists might win the free elections scheduled for that spring.
It was perfectly reasonable for the United States to fear that Stalin might have a master plan in which he was going to use the Communist Party in Italy and the Communist Party in France to take over those 2 countries. He wasn't, but the United States had no means of knowing it.
The Italian communists were being financed from Moscow. Armed with cash, the CIA went to Italy determined to outspend the Russians. Politicians, newspaper publishers, and election officials were bribed. The CIA-backed Christian Democrats won the election. It was a big win for the West and soon led to more interventions in Europe.
The CIA soon had a clandestine station in every country in the world. We soon had all kinds of foreign agents operating. We set up various organizations, front groups, to work with various peoples, indigenous, outcasts, exiles, providing them with money, inspiration, leadership, support.
There were few limits on the OPC, but there was one basic restraint. Any and all operations were to be planned and conducted so that the responsibility for these actions could not be directly traced to the United States government. It was imperative for the credibility of U.S. foreign policy that the President or the State Department be able to plausibly deny any knowledge of such actions.
Plausible deniability is the underlying definition of a covert action. Covert really means plausibly deniable by the President. Plausible denial is probably better known as spinning.
Their success in swaying the Italian elections left the CIA feeling optimistic. If a country could be prevented from turning communist, maybe an existing communist system could be overthrown. In the spring of 1949, the United States chose Albania for the CIA's first attempt at subversion behind the Iron Curtain.
OPC got greedy, and they thought that they could overthrow communism in Eastern Europe, so they hoped to stage a counter-revolution, essentially. Well, of course, the communists were good at counter-subversion. They had very strong state security, and they rolled it all up. It was a fiasco. Pretty much everybody we dropped behind enemy lines in Albania was captured and put on a show trial and shot.
There was good reason for the efficiency of Albanian state security in rounding up the CIA-backed penetrators. They'd been tipped ahead of time in each case. The informant was a senior British intelligence official with close ties to the CIA. His name was Kim Philby. He'd been spying for the Soviets since the 1930s. The Albanian operation had been a cruel yet valuable lesson for the CIA. The Soviets were not to be underestimated, but neither was the OPC, and they were just getting started. By 1950, the CIA and its new operations arm, the OPC, realized they were at a distinct disadvantage when it came to clandestine warfare. For one thing, the Russians had been at it longer. They'd been spying on the world and each other since the Tsars had been in power.
The KGB had the backing of a totalitarian state and was extremely powerful and was well known to the people. I mean, it had a secret police arm. KGB guy can grab you in the street and you might not be heard from for a long time, if ever. CIA has no law enforcement powers. Never has, never will. The KGB win, in my opinion, because they developed more good spies operating in the United States than the United States developed good spies operating behind the Iron Curtain.
It was easier to keep secrets in a closed society, and it was much more difficult to spy in a country when access to that country was controlled and everyone in it was being watched.
The communists helped get themselves in power by subversion, so they were good at it. They knew how to do sting operations and to spy and to run covert operations, and the KGB was really better than we were, at least at the outset. And they were very good at sucking us in, making us think that we were having a success, drawing us in and then slamming the door on our hands.
Ground zero in the Cold War was the occupied city of Berlin. The line that divided the Russian-held sector from that of England, France, and the United States marked the figurative border between East and West, between the free world and the authoritarian world. There were literally thousands of Soviet and East German state security agents in Berlin, enough to watch every man, woman, and child who lived there. The CIA operatives had a nickname for the former German capital. They called it Kidnap Town.
It was wild and woolly. It was the Wild West. The Soviets would try to kidnap our agents, and this guy would be walking down the street and a car would come along and just pull him into the car and he would disappear. There was an unwritten agreement that they didn't kidnap Americans. They mostly take our clients, Eastern Europeans who are working for us or Germans who are working for us.
There were other rules of procedure in this deadly game of cat and mouse, of tit for tat. Arrest one of their spies and they took one of yours. Captured spies were not prosecuted, but instead exchanged. These exchanges usually took place on a bridge like the Gleinecke, which spanned the Spree River. It marked the border between East and West Berlin. Assassination was not an option because retaliation was sure to come in kind.
You're much better off knowing who the top agent is than to shoot him and get rid of him. Who will replace him? You don't know who the replacement is. You've identified that agent. You're that much ahead of the game. Then you try to see if you can double that agent back. You begin to try to feed him information or open contact with him. In other words, this is the game. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't.
Actually, we had sort of a tacit agreement not to kill each other, not to murder each other. We met the CIA people all the time. I myself did it a lot of time, but mainly with the purpose to find out what sort of a man he is, whether he is recruitable or non-recruitable, and so on. But it's a normal procedure for spying.
In September 1949, CIA and U.S. Air Force scientists detected the presence of a radioactive cloud over the North Pacific, which indicated that the Russians had detonated an atomic device somewhere on the mainland of Asia. Now the Russians, too, had the ultimate weapon of terror. Would they use it? And if they did, how and where would they use it? At the annual May Day parade in Moscow in 1948, the Soviets had unveiled a new bomber, the Tu-4. The fact that they developed the plane so quickly gave rise to the theory that the Russians were far more advanced in their bomber production than previously thought, and might actually have more bombers than the United States. Now that the Russians had displayed the bomb for all the world to see, that debate took on new urgency. Was there a gap? Did the Russians have more bombers and atomic bombs than the Americans? While the CIA searched for answers, the United States stepped up the pace in the arms race. In 1953, Dwight Eisenhower came to the American presidency with a pledge to end the Korean War. He brought with him a new enthusiasm and respect for clandestine warfare. Once he'd negotiated a truce in America's last remaining hot war, he set out to fight the cold one.
It's only with the election of Dwight D. Eisenhower that covert action becomes simply the main activity of the CIA. Now, Truman had been won over it bit by bit, but he would go so far and no further.
Eisenhower was fascinated by covert action. He was impressed by what OSS had done for him to help him in Europe during the war, and he thought this was a technique that could be more widely applied. And he distrusted the use of the Army. He didn't want to get into that, being a general himself. So he turned the CIA into a private presidential army.
While Harry Truman had authorized covert action against the Soviet bloc, Korea, and Southeast Asia, Eisenhower saw opportunities for covert action wherever American interests were at stake. And the former Supreme Allied commander especially appreciated the concept of plausible deniability. Eisenhower appointed Allen Dulles, ex-OSS spymaster, as the new director of Central Intelligence. The two men endorsed covert action as by far the lesser of two evils. Neither man had any desire to fight another hot war, but both were looking to score a win against the Soviets in the Cold One. Since the 1930s, much of the Western world depended on Iran as their oil supplier. The Shahs had an agreement with a British oil company which paid them royalties. Then in 1951, a nationalist named Mohammad Mossadegh came to power, undercutting the weak Shah. Mossadegh nationalized the British oil holdings, turned a cold shoulder to the Shah's Western allies, and began to court favor with Russia. The United States, at risk of losing influence in the Middle East, turned to the CIA. Kermit Roosevelt, grandson to Teddy, was the CIA's best Middle Eastern operative. He had himself smuggled into the palace in Tehran, where he met secretly with Reza Pahlavi, the young Shah. Roosevelt tried to convince the Shah to denounce Mossadegh before the Iranian National Assembly. Pahlavi agreed, but shortly afterward, rioting broke out in the streets and the Shah fled to Rome. Roosevelt said, "The Shah is a wimp," but he still had a plan left. He paid $10,000 to some street toughs and circus muscle men to stage a riot favoring the Shah. To everyone's surprise, the riot escalated and Mossadegh was forced to relinquish his power. The Shah returned to rule as a strong ally of the Western influences that had given him back his throne. The CIA's success in Iran brought elation to Washington. Restoring the Shah through covert means had been relatively easy. The entire operation had cost less than $200,000. And the CIA's involvement in the coup had stayed a secret.
This gave the CIA the feeling that they could do anything. That if you could get rid of the communists in Iran, why couldn't you do it elsewhere? So they did the next year in Guatemala.
In 1954, the Central American country of Guatemala seemed on track to become the first country in the Western Hemisphere to turn communist. That country's apparently leftist president, Jacobo Arbenz, had seized the holdings there of the United Fruit Company, an American enterprise. Flush with the success of Iran, the CIA organized a revolt in Guatemala. They raised a guerrilla army, deployed a secret air force, and even chose a leader to replace Arbenz. The CIA's man, Colonel Castillo Armas, was virtually unknown in the general population, and his army was outnumbered. But propaganda broadcasts from secret CIA radio stations portrayed the rebel leader as the people's choice for president, in command of an overwhelming force. The rebels attacked Guatemala City on June 18th under CIA air support. That support had been approved personally by President Eisenhower. It was over in a matter of days. Arbenz was driven from power, and the CIA-backed Armas was installed as president.
And that made them very heady with success. The feeling was they were kind of world shakers and world movers, and they could probably overthrow any government they really put their mind to.
But the CIA would soon find that success in the Cold War was all too often an illusion. In June of 1950, civil war split Korea in two. The Russians supported North Korea. The United States and her NATO allies entered the war in defense of the South. During the course of this conflict, the United States became alarmed as captured American servicemen were displayed in show trials. They were shocked further when these servicemen denounced their own country for crimes and aggression against the Korean people.
How can I go back and face my family? In a civilized world, how can I tell them these things? That I am a criminal in the eyes of humanity. They are my flesh and blood.
The CIA suspected the communists were using drugs to brainwash prisoners. In an effort to find out what drugs the enemy was using and develop some means of countering their effects, the CIA began a series of top-secret projects that would ultimately be known as MK-Ultra. These programs tested various drugs on human guinea pigs. Army doctors had observed that certain anesthetics made soldiers speak freely while unconscious. The CIA experimented with various truth serums for use in debriefing captured agents, and they were particularly interested in developing a means of controlling or changing human thought patterns and behavior. The ultimate aim of these tests was to create nothing less than a human robot. In some cases, the persons being tested were volunteers. In others, they were completely uninformed as to what was happening to them. At one point in 1953, 7 volunteers were kept on lysergic acid, diethylamide, better known as LSD, for 77 days. Following another LSD experiment that November, Frank Olson, an Army scientist who had volunteered to be a guinea pig, became severely depressed and committed suicide by hurling himself through a 10th-story hotel window. Sub-Project 142 of MK-Ultra was a series of experiments with animals to see if they could be used as delivery systems for microphones, cameras, and bombs. In one case, a cat was surgically implanted with a listening device, batteries and all. In his tail was an antenna for transmitting back to his handlers. The CIA scientists took their eavesdropping cat to a park for a test run, but before they even got started, the animal was run over by a taxi. Despite occasional setbacks, like the death of Frank Olson, the MK-Ultra experiments continued until 1975. In that year, a Senate investigation into CIA activities brought the excesses of MK-Ultra into the open, causing much embarrassment for the agency. The CIA was feeling confident with its successes in Iran and Guatemala, but the Americans still hadn't been able to penetrate the Soviet bloc, or had they? In 1953, the CIA partnered with British intelligence for a brazen foray into and underneath the Soviet sector of Berlin. The plan was to tunnel into East Berlin to reach a bank of underground phone cables. From there, they could tap into secret communications between Soviet and East German military headquarters. The Berlin tunnel operation ran for 11 months, not including the year it took for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to dig it. It ran 15 feet below the surface for 300 yards and had 6 feet of headroom. Many of the details surrounding the tunnel remain classified to this day. What is known remains a topic of controversy. Questions still abound as to the genuineness of the intelligence extracted from these phone taps. Because the KGB apparently knew from the beginning that the West was digging the tunnel. One of the tunnel planners, a British MI6 operative named George Blake, was in fact a KGB spy. It was not until 1961, when Blake was betrayed by a defector and arrested, that the CIA learned the truth. The KGB had known about the tunnel all along, before the first shovelful of dirt was turned. Why did the KGB wait a full year before alerting the Soviet military that their phones were being tapped? In the years following Blake's arrest, interviews with Soviet defectors revealed that the KGB, in order to protect Blake from discovery, deliberately failed to inform the Soviet military of the tunnel's existence and the fact that the CIA was listening to their phone conversations. George Blake's safety was that important to them.
And having an agent at the heart of British intelligence at the time was regarded by them as priceless. And all I can say is that it took a very strong KGB influence to be willing to forget the Soviet military. So I imagine that most of that stuff is valid today, just as it was valid then.
The CIA had tried with uncertain success to penetrate Soviet security from 15 feet below. Their next attempt to spy on the Russians would take them more than a mile into the sky. Since the Cold War began, the CIA had been unable to penetrate the Soviet bloc far enough to discover just how immediate the Soviet threat was. Then, in 1954, President Eisenhower approved a top-secret plan to develop an airplane capable of flying across the Soviet Union, north to south, without refueling. The plane, designated U-2, would eventually fly at 70 to 80,000 feet, higher than Soviet missiles could then reach. It was outfitted with a high-resolution camera designed by the Polaroid Corporation. In order to maintain utmost secrecy, responsibility for developing and operating the U-2 was given not to the Air Force, but to the CIA.
Eisenhower did not trust the military to be secure. And it's hard to imagine, but he's the guy who picked CIA to be in charge of the U-2, the SR-71, and the Corona satellite. It's the kind of thing that the military could have done, I think, and probably should have done. But Eisenhower wanted security, and he thought the only way to do it was to let CIA run the thing.
The CIA estimated they could safely fly the U-2 over Russia for 2 years before the Russians would be able to detect the plane and shoot it down. But it's now clear that the Soviets tracked the first flight and every one after that.
Khrushchev knew it was overflying Russia at 80,000 feet. We had announced that the height that plane could fly was 65,000 feet. It was flying at 80,000 feet because Khrushchev's most powerful missile would only go to 65,000 feet. So here was this plane flying overhead, his missiles unable to reach it, and he was furious, fit to be tied.
The U-2 flights gave the CIA the comprehensive look inside the Soviet Union they'd wanted for 10 years. In approximately 24 flights over a 2-year period, the U-2 pinpointed Soviet air bases, allowing the U.S. Air Force not only to count bombers and missiles, but to specifically target these sites. But the Americans did not hold their advantage for long. In 1957, the Russians stunned the West with 2 demonstrations of technological strength. In August, they successfully fired their first long-range intercontinental missile, and 2 months later launched Sputnik, the first satellite into space. It was immediately apparent to the CIA that a country capable of launching a rocket into space was more than capable of shooting down the U-2. The flights were halted temporarily. The U-2 flew only sporadically over the next 3 years. Then, on May Day 1960, the Russians finally shot one down. The Americans, thinking the pilot, Francis Gary Powers, had been killed, called the flight a weather plane that went astray. But the Soviets had the CIA pilot in hand and displayed him to the world in a show trial. The CIA had been caught red-handed. An embarrassed American president was forced to take responsibility for the spy flight, and the Russians scored a major propaganda coup. Powers' ill-fated mission brought a halt to the U-2 flights over Soviet airspace. Plausible deniability had sounded good in theory, but when the chips were down, it hadn't worked.
The idea was to keep Eisenhower from having to admit that he had approved the flight. Well, eventually Eisenhower himself made the decision that he was going to admit that he'd done it and be honest with the world and with the American people. Plausible deniability, if it didn't die with the U-2, you might as well say it died with the U-2.
He simply thought that the U-2 was impregnable and that the Soviets weren't capable or bright enough to knock it down. This was one of the problems. We did not think through in some of our covert actions what happens if the things go sour.
Less than 6 months after the last U-2 flight over the Soviet Union, the CIA was flying again, this time even higher. Corona, the world's first spy satellite, was successfully launched into space on August 18, 1960, after more than a dozen failures. Since the launch of a rocket ship was difficult to keep secret, the United States publicized the launchings but concealed the rocket's real mission. To the world, Corona was a weather satellite known as Discoverer, but its real mission was photographing the Russians from space and dropping the film back to Earth in a protective capsule. On that first successful flight, Corona photographed 1.5 million miles of Soviet airspace, more than all the U-2 flights combined.
By the time this particular photographic satellite had finished its work over a period of 2 or 3 years, the United States had a very good idea of how strong the Russians were militarily. In fact, the information pulled together over time was sufficiently accurate that when the SALT I negotiations were going on, the Russians finally said, we won't tell you all the things that we have. We'll use your figures.
In the 1960 presidential campaign, candidate John F. Kennedy made political capital by criticizing the Eisenhower administration for falling behind Russia in the production of missiles and warheads. This assault put his opponent, Richard Nixon, in a difficult position. As Eisenhower's vice president, Nixon was privy to CIA reports which proved there was no missile gap. In fact, Russia was having difficulties with her intercontinental missile system. But this information was top secret, and Nixon couldn't use it to rebut Kennedy's attacks. Another Kennedy campaign promise called for assisting the Cuban patriots who wanted to overthrow Cuban Premier Fidel Castro, an avowed communist with strong Soviet ties. Here again, Nixon was unable to divulge another top secret, that the Republican incumbents were already planning a CIA-backed invasion of Cuba by a force of exiles. Kennedy won the election, but both of these issues would soon come back to haunt him.
The CIA had begun training a lot of Cuban exiles in Central America. The theory that they would go back to Cuba and overthrow Castro. And Kennedy inherited this expedition. It's not something he would have initiated himself, but he was, in a sense, trapped by it.
On April 16, 1961, less than 3 months after Kennedy took office, a brigade of CIA-backed Cuban exiles prepared to invade Cuba. The plan called for a military-style landing at the Bay of Pigs. But when preliminary bombings raised an outcry in the United Nations, U.S. Ambassador Adlai Stevenson demanded the attack be canceled. That hesitation would prove fatal.
Adlai Stevenson just really wrecked it by saying, you know, I'm here at the United Nations giving out this information on my word, and you're doing something else. Makes me look like a liar. We're going to have to change things so you don't fly that second flight of airplanes. So President Kennedy stood down our second flight of airplanes.
There wasn't time to call off the landings, but Kennedy canceled the air support. By this time, Castro's army was ready and waiting. Although President Kennedy publicly took blame for the Bay of Pigs fiasco, privately he blamed the CIA. Both Director of Central Intelligence Allen Dulles and his covert chief Richard Bissell, the man behind the U-2 and Corona successes, were forced to resign.
Bay of Pigs was a horrible setback. They lost their director, they lost their head of dirty tricks. The President of the United States quietly vowed to break the CIA into 1,000 pieces. They lost their sort of prime position as the President's action arm. It was the end of sort of high opera covert action, but it was not the end of covert action by any means.
As bad as the humiliation of the Cuban invasion had been for the new president, the failure at the Bay of Pigs only served to intensify ongoing American efforts to depose Fidel Castro. Now Kennedy wanted him as badly as the CIA did. Cuban Premier Fidel Castro had come to power in 1959 and immediately made an enemy of the United States by first seizing American property and then dispatching teams of guerrillas to invade other Latin American countries. He'd been in power less than a year when the CIA began considering plans to eliminate him. Since the CIA did not wish to be directly involved in an assassination plot, most of these attempts involved third parties. Some potential operatives were recruited from South Florida's large population of anti-Castro Cuban exiles. But the exiles were infiltrated by members of Castro's secret police who'd been trained by intelligence officers from the Soviet bloc. Plots against Castro were compromised before they left the United States. Mongoose, the CIA code name for the government-wide operation to overthrow Castro, came under the personal direction of Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. Richard Helms, the CIA's new deputy director for plans, found himself under intense pressure from the White House.
Both President Kennedy and Robert Kennedy were obviously very upset by the Bay of Pigs failure. And I haven't any doubt that they decided that they were going to do everything they possibly could to get even with Castro. Bobby Kennedy pushed very hard, there wasn't any doubt about it, just as hard as he could. But there were limits to how fast one could do this kind of thing.
Some of the more imaginative plans to kill Castro bordered on the ludicrous.
They tried to put poisons on a cigar to give Castro so he would smoke a cigar that would kill him. They wanted to plant an exploding seashell off the coast of Cuba in the hopes that Castro, as a skin diver, would pick it up. Why they thought Castro would pick up that particular shell was never clear.
Another plan involved sprinkling thallium salts into Castro's shoes, which were expected to make his beard fall out and destroy his charisma. Still another plan had the CIA enlisting the help of the American Mafia in putting a hit on Castro. The Dons were more than happy to accept the contract. Castro's revolution had brought a halt to their gambling operations in Havana and driven them out of Cuba. But getting to Castro would prove difficult. At least one expedition of Mafia-backed Cuban expatriates disappeared soon after landing in Cuba. As each plan failed, or was discounted as impractical, the CIA and the Kennedy brothers became more determined to get rid of the Cuban dictator. The most ominous effect of the Bay of Pigs episode was that it made the Russians bold. Premier Nikita Khrushchev decided Kennedy was weak and stepped up the pressure by sending more arms to Cuba. Then, in another act of Soviet belligerence, the Berlin Wall went up, seemingly overnight.
The reports came in, they're building a wall right in the middle of the city. Why are they doing this? Well, we didn't understand Lenin's famous saying, people must not be allowed to vote with their feet. You cannot leave communism. You can't walk out because that threatens the whole system. So the Berlin Wall was to keep people in, not to keep us out.
In 1960, a disgruntled Soviet military intelligence officer, Oleg Penkovsky, began to pass secret documents and photographs to the CIA. This material included descriptions of Soviet missile emplacements. 2 years later, in October 1962, a CIA spy in Cuba reported something strange going on in the Cuban countryside. His report prompted a U-2 flyover of the island. Photographs from this and subsequent flights revealed what the CIA believed were missile sites under construction. CIA analysts checked the photographs against the manual of the Russian SS-4 medium-range missiles Penkovsky had given them. In the manual was a diagram which showed exactly what a completed missile firing position should look like. By comparing the diagram with the U-2 photographs, the CIA was able to determine that it would be several days before the missiles could be ready for firing. This information gave President Kennedy the time he needed to decide his strategy and to confront and face down Khrushchev. Penkovsky's manual may have been the most critical piece of intelligence in the Cold War because it prevented what could have been a catastrophic overreaction by the United States. The CIA's U-2 spy flights, coupled with the information provided by Penkovsky, gave President Kennedy the intelligence he needed to confront the Soviets in the Western Hemisphere and to force their hand. The Soviets dismantled their missile sites and the crisis was over, for the moment. The missile crisis had passed, but Operation Mongoose, the plan for the removal, one way or another, of Premier Fidel Castro, remained the CIA's top priority. The agency, at the urging of Robert Kennedy, continued to shop for assassins. They believed they'd found one in Rolando Cobela, a Cuban major with access to Castro. In the fall of 1963, a high-level CIA staff officer met with Cobela in Paris. Cobela was willing to kill the dictator as part of a coup d'etat. The Cuban asked for sniper's rifles and poisons. He also requested a personal meeting with Robert Kennedy, the president's brother. That request was denied. Another meeting was set for the following month. On November 22nd, Cobela met with a CIA case officer who offered him a pen capable of injecting poison, with instructions to stick it into Castro at his first opportunity. Cobela refused the weapon, but asked that the rifles be smuggled into Cuba for him. On the day that meeting took place in Paris, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Speculation arose in some corners of Washington that Cobela was a double agent actually working for Castro.
Some senator got the idea that because a CIA man was in touch with Cobela on the day that Kennedy was assassinated, he had something to do with the assassination. That's nonsense. And the conversation that this man had with Cobela had nothing to do with assassinating Castro. It had to do with whether they could organize a coup in Cuba. This is exactly what the Kennedys wanted us to try to do.
There were other interpretations. President Lyndon Johnson himself would later tell an advisor, Kennedy was trying to kill Castro, but Castro got him first. The new president sent word to his Central Intelligence Agency that there were to be no more attempts on the life of the Cuban leader. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the most dangerous confrontation of the Cold War. It would not be the last, but never again would tensions between the superpowers rise to such a boiling point. For 3 more decades, the global chess match plodded on. In the glacial struggle, neither side was willing to commit its most powerful piece. The skirmishes took place for the most part in the Third World: Vietnam, Central America, South America, the Middle East, Africa. Superpowers vied for influence, prestige, and more power. For 28 years, the Berlin Wall stood as a symbol of the political, economic, and philosophical divisions between East and West. Then, in 1989 and 1990, political unrest behind the Iron Curtain led to the reunification of Germany. The Cold War, after 45 years, came to an end. The wall had come tumbling down. Could a winner be declared?
We won the Cold War. Let's not hide our heads under a bushel here. We won the Cold War. Communism was rejected.
The evidence that this agency has that we won the Cold War is we have a piece of what I think was the most palpable, dramatic representation of the Cold War, and that was the Berlin Wall. We have it on our compound, 3 panels of the Berlin Wall. We got a piece of the rock.
But how much credit could the CIA take for this victory?
The CIA did the job that it was supposed to do. Its slice of the thing was to find out what was going on in the Soviet Union, how big their military establishment was, what they were doing in the way of producing new weapons, how many intercontinental ballistic missiles they had, etc. But the American people also contributed to this. They paid the taxes that paid the bill.
We won the Cold War, in effect, and less because of anything we did than because communism turned out to be a moral disaster, an economic disaster, and a political disaster. And the people of Russia couldn't stand it any longer, and the people in Eastern Europe hated it anyway. And that's why the Cold War came to an end.
It was a clear victory, but it had taken a long time, 45 years. The best evidence of the CIA's effectiveness in fighting the Cold War is that it was able to buy time as the Cold War progressed. By providing a constant window into the closed society of the Soviet Union, the CIA kept fear and paranoia from driving the superpowers into war. The world stood on the brink for 45 years, but World War III never came. In the end, one way of life prevailed over another. The ideals of one society gave way to the imagination of the other. One system collapsed. The other endured. The Berlin Wall at last was down, and the people were reunited.
The documentary you just heard is a concise history of critical covert elements contained in the CIA's history. While it represents a reasonable and appropriate position on most of the topics, there are two statements of fact in particular that I would like to call out. The first relates to whether or not the Kennedy brothers, either one of them, ever specifically called for an assassination plot related to Fidel Castro. Comments in this episode's video suggest that, but the historical record does not support the idea that either Robert or John Kennedy called for an assassination plot related to Fidel Castro. It's no secret now that President Kennedy and his brother, the Attorney General Robert Kennedy, wanted Fidel removed from power in Cuba. After Castro thwarted the Kennedy-approved and CIA-orchestrated invasion at the Bay of Pigs in April 1961, the Kennedys continued to seek means of toppling the Cuban leader. In early 1962, according to a CIA memo, Bobby Kennedy told a group of CIA and Pentagon officials that a solution to the Cuban problem carried the top priority in the United States government. All else is secondary. Soon after, the CIA, which had begun planning murder plots against Castro, plots which began during the Eisenhower administration, once again began devising a variety of assassination plans. Efforts that would involve, among so many other things, an exploding seashell, poison pills, a toxin-contaminated diving suit, and even the use of mafia associates to make a hit. Ever since this clandestine activity started becoming public in the 1970s, former CIA officers have maintained that John and Robert Kennedy were fully aware of and supportive of the agency's lethal intentions, and that the CIA conspirators were not rogues but loyal civil servants following orders. Kennedy defenders have fiercely countered that there is no credible evidence that the pair specifically endorsed or authorized an assassination hit related to Fidel Castro. In his book, entitled Robert Kennedy and His Times, historian and former Kennedy administration official Arthur Schlesinger Jr. passionately declared, "The available evidence clearly leads to the conclusion that the Kennedys did not know about the Castro assassination plots before the Bay of Pigs or about the pursuit of those plots by the CIA after the Bay of Pigs." Schlesinger would go on to say that no one who knew John and Robert Kennedy well believed that they would conceivably countenance a program of assassination. He would say, "I, too, find the idea incredible that these two men, so filled with love of life and so conscious of the ironies of history, could thus deny all the values and purposes that animated their existence." In 1998, at Schlesinger's urging, the New York Times published an editor's note saying that while some historians and officials with knowledge of intelligence matters have asserted that JFK ordered the CIA to assassinate Castro, others, also close to the president, fiercely dispute their account. The second matter has to do with the comments made about Frank Olson and the MK Ultra program. While the documentary was accurate in that the Frank Olson matter was a stain on the reputation of the CIA, in actuality, the comments made in the tape did not properly represent the seriousness of the charges against the CIA in the Frank Olson case. We will cover the Frank Olson matter in a separate episode, but the implication was that Olson's death was not a suicide, and in fact, he may have been murdered by the CIA. The Olson family received a compensatory check in 1976, delivered to them directly by the then-President Gerald Ford in the White House. After more than a generation of seeking the truth by the Olsen family, on November 28, 2012, some 36 years after the original settlement, sons Eric and Nils Olsen filed suit in the U.S. District Court in Washington, D.C. They were seeking unspecified compensatory damages as well as access to documents related to their father's death and other matters that they claimed the CIA had withheld from them. The case was dismissed in July 2013, due in part to the 1976 settlement between the family and the government. In the decision dismissing the suit, U.S. District Judge James Boasberg wrote, "While the court must limit its analysis to the four corners of the complaint, the skeptical reader may wish to know that the public record supports many of the allegations in the family suit, far-fetched as they may sound." Thank you for listening to episode 115 of JFK, The Enduring Secret.